Welcome to 2026! We hope you got to have a good rest. 2025 was hectic, but don't worry if you missed any of our videos. We've compiled all of them into one massive video. How did only 6 videos end up being this long? Well, you'll just have to watch and find out.
Imagine, if you will, a world where men only have eyes for other men and women only have eyes for other women. A world of representation and controversy that has intrigued academics and youths for decades.
As kinda academics ourselves, while researching the etymology for yaoi for our video on Bishonen and Bishoujo, we were immediately intrigued by the constant back and forth between Asian and Western fan bases of these subcultures, and just knew we had to spend weeks of our lives consumed by it.
For those unaware, Yuri, or GL, is used to describe predominantly Asian media that heavily features gay women. It's almost always as a subgenre of romance, but it can span any other genre such as horror, fantasy, and historical. Yaoi, or BL, is the same but for gay men. Bisexuals supposedly exist, but we have no conclusive proof of this. Being once a teenage girl with unsupervised internet access, I am intimately aware of what yaoi is. But maybe you were only one of those things, or none at all. So let us guide you into the world of men loving other men. My first memories of yaoi was reading the manga Totally Captivated, which I would later discover was actually a manhwa, and I had read it the wrong way round. This happened to me a lot as a naive youth who thought any and all black and white comics with Asian sounding names were from Japan. It's almost as if knowing basic information like where something is from and how that particular media should be read is important. But anyway, I was totally captivated, by the explicit relationship between Iwon and Mukyul. It was edgy and cool, and there was sex. I read it again a few years ago. It's a comedy. 14-year-olds really view the world differently to 22-year-olds. But anyway, this was the start of me ruining my own life. I was intrigued by this strange new world of sexuality where I was entirely separate from the events happening due to being a girl. It had cool, edgy plots of dubious consent, violence, and other taboos that was so cool to my naive child brain. I did also read Yuri around this time. There was a distinct lack of gore, so I moved on.
That sounds like a you problem. I love cute Yuri dramas, but we can talk more about that later.
Yes, these were absolutely things I shouldn't have been reading. But I also read a lot of horror at this age, because teenagers love to believe they are much more mature than they actually are. So I had a lot of first-hand knowledge on this subject. But in terms of the academic theory, what did I actually know about this continent-spanning genre that still doesn't actually really exist in my own culture?
Yaoi originated in the 1970s shoujo boom and went by many names: BL, Tenbi, and June. Tenbi was previously conceived for novels in the early 20th century, and means aesthetic or aestheticism. These earlier novels had a focus on heterosexual eroticism, and, as the name implies, it was in a pursuit of beauty. These were often highly regarded in general Japanese culture, with several authors of the movement winning Nobel Prizes for literature. You may recognize the kanji bi in Tenbi, because it's the same kanji from Bishonen and Bishoujo. Ten means to be absorbed into something. Unlike everything else we talk about on this channel, this term fully originated in Japan, and actually went on to become the Chinese word danmei, which is a genre of romantic relationships between men. It came to be in the 1990s after those 70s shoujo made their way to China via Taiwanese pirating communities translating them. It also has an entirely separate community and genre conventions, but let's not get too sidetracked. This video is about Yuri and yaoi, not danmei and baihei. June has a far more simple origin, as it was the name of a magazine publication that was created to publish exclusively male homosexual manga and novels. Originally named June from the Japanese for pure, as well as the manga Jun, which was a one-shot written by Shotaro Ishinomori, about a boy wanting to make manga despite his father's wishes. Write what you know, I guess. However, a dispute from the fashion brand Jun made the publication add an E to the end to stop confusion between the two. June, now with an E, lasted 85 issues spanning 17 years, but its synonymous meaning for boys' love had waned much before then. Many publications moved to the term BL, or boys' love, but it's credited to Image magazine. Although we couldn't actually find this magazine, but the term was popularized by Puff magazine, who wanted a catch-all term for all these various stories depicting boys who love each other, and is specifically the English translation for the term shonen ai. Alongside this development, the term yaoi was coined by doujinshi artists. Wait, we've already done this. Roll the tape.
Yaoi is an abbreviation for the phrase Yamanashi, Ochinashi, Iminashi, which means no climax, no point, and no meaning, with ya, o, and I being the first letters of each phrase. It was coined by doujinshi artists and is supposed to be a little self-deprecating, very similar to the fanfiction term porn without plot, which is often abbreviated to PWP. It is also a term heavily adopted by older Western anime fans as a catch-all for any manga or anime depicting gay male romances.
A common theme with these terms is an emphasis on beauty for the sake of beauty, and an almost frivolous approach to narrative, instead prioritizing the erotic scenes without all that fluff. They are used interchangeably despite these differing origins, with varying popularity over time and location. Interestingly, this focus on just the smut is quite different to how women's sexuality tends to be seen, if it's seen at all. Now that's the etymology of it all, but what's the history?
For this one, we go back to the 11th century Japan. The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. It's often described as one of history's first novels, although that depends on your definition of novel and also first. It details the life of Genji, a disowned son of the emperor, and his life living as an ordinary man. It also depicts what is considered the earliest example of male homosexuality in Japanese fiction, wherein Genji sleeps with the brother of a woman he's pursuing. So to understand the history of yaoi, we must first also understand the history of homosexuality in Japan, because the two are surprisingly heavily entwined. Around this same era, there are diaries that discuss homosexuality, and specifically the emperor's tendency towards sexual relationships with handsome younger boys, or bishonen. At this time in Japanese history, there was no ban or cultural taboo on homosexuality, and we see the concept of nanshoku develop. Nanshoku was a relationship between an adult monk, the ninja, and a young apprentice, the chigo. The relationship between the two was sexual as well as educational, and was not intended to continue once the boy reached adulthood. We discussed this in the Bishonen and Bishoujo video for samurai, and this ties heavily to adolescent boys operating as a tertiary gender in the culture of the time. In fact, it was the practice of nanshoku that directly inspired the samurai, who would often be educated in the monasteries of China and adopted the practice once they became adults. Obviously, exploiting young boys for culturally acceptable sex is amoral and shouldn't be condoned. But this type of relationship was accepted by some at the time, and did go on to inspire a lot of yaoi fiction. This specific monk and apprentice, or samurai and wakashu dynamic, was fictionalized in a lot of literature in the following centuries. This admiration only grew when the samurai were instructed to live in cities due to the Tokugawa shogunate worrying about them rising up against the shogun, and so they also brought the tradition of the wakashu with them. Due to its origin from the upper-class samurai, these relationships had a sense of prestige and sophistication about them. The lower classes wanted to emulate this, but they didn't have the money to have a live-in boy toy. So this led to a boom in male prostitution, and these prostitutes would go on to be heavily depicted in art and literature of the time. Nanshoku Okagami by Ihara Saikaku was an anthology of 40 erotic tales of male homosexuality, and covered nanshoku, wakashu, and male prostitutes as topics. This era would also begin to codify the sexual dynamics of male homosexuality that we still see in contemporary yaoi today, with the younger receiving and the older giving, as well as the concepts of power imbalance and dubious levels of consent from the younger man. The art of this time was explicit and ubiquitous, reflecting its acceptability in the culture, or at least amongst artists. The Meiji Restoration ushered forth a new age of economic, political, and social revolution. Part of this was an adoption of Western ideals, including homophobia. However, the nanshoku ways persisted amongst soldiers and the navy in an emulation of samurai bushido. Of course, I'm sure spending the long, lonely nights with only the companionship of other men had no relevance to this. The Meiji era saw a rejection of outdated traditions in Japanese society, and while anti-sodomy laws were passed, they actually only lasted 8 years before being overturned. However, just because it was legal didn't mean homosexuality was seen as acceptable. Some sexologists of the time worried that homosexuality in men would cause them to physically become women, and drew on the claims of one theatre actor who claimed he had become so much a woman that he now had periods. Most sexologists drew on effeminate actions and gender presentation, such as being weak, useless, or not liking baseball. Instead of being a temporary third gender like the wakashu, homosexual men were instead seen as a permanent state of being that began in childhood and persisted into adulthood. This state of being was very emphatically seen as wrong and undesirable, and was due to some kind of damage or flaw in the person that resulted in this atypical desire. Slandering all gays as perverts did cause some sexologists to be conflicted, as this would mean their masculine samurai ancestors were in fact now considered degenerate, broken men. This means a lot of the works at the time tried to tiptoe around historical homosexuality as something distinct and thus okay. Part of this was a return to the idea of temporary homosexuality as a normal and healthy period of psychosexual development, as well as this perversion being reappropriated as a term that had positive connotations. You may know this Japanese term as hentai. Hentai was borrowed from the medical context of perversion and in some ways became a way for the general population to reclaim clinical discussions of their sexuality, as well as claim authority by using complex terminology. The emerging middle class of the time found these sexology texts fascinating, and in codifying these perversions, they inadvertently made the masses aware of them as a legitimate identity, even if it was one that was undesirable. History is so often a swinging pendulum of acceptance and rejection. The 1920s and 30s saw a rise of a social and art movement known as Ero-Guro Nansensu, or erotic grotesque nonsense. Ero was defined by the embracing of sexual revolution, Guro for the rejection of traditional beauty standards, and Nansensu the search for a self-created meaning in a post-war world where the life that had been expected to be lived had been utterly destroyed. In the 50s, and post that other war, male prostitution was on an intense rise. A psychologist of this time claimed that the mass-scale social damage from the wars directly caused a perversion of male sexuality, and that's why dozens of men cross-dressed and moonlighted in Ueno Park. It isn't as if in times of economic downturn, people might resort to drastic measures to make enough money to live, and are thus forced to participate in activities that may make them part of a disadvantaged minority. Clearly, the individual penetration of a prostitute is a metaphor for the post-war pillaging of our country. Jesus Christ, just write erotic novels instead of academic texts. But anyway, now we finally catch up to yaoi being established. Magazines exclusively printing gay male stories are all the rage amongst women, and mostly drawn by heterosexual women themselves. Often drawing on idealized settings and character archetypes, these works tended to be tragic and emotional as opposed to overtly sexual. But these audiences actually wanted that sexuality, and so yaoi doujins came to fill that niche. They rose in popularity alongside shonen manga, and borrowed their characters to spread erotic/fiction at fan expos like Comiket. Magazine editors saw this demand and hired those same doujinshi mangaka to work for them. Zetsuai 1989 is the story of a rock star and a football player falling in love, and was originally a doujin by Nina Miyazaki of Captain Tsubasa characters. The couple involved were Kojiro Hyuga and Ken Wakashimazu. Adjustments were made. Despite its massive impact on the genre, Zetsuai 1989 isn't available in English, but it is available in French and German.
We have a whole video idea on how much better French and German manga publishers treat their fans, but that's for another day.
Also influential at this time was Banana Fish by Akemi Yoshida, which ran from 1985 to 1994, and did get an English release, bringing yaoi as a concept to the West. The emphasis on prostitution and crime can both be seen as fetishistic, but also a sincere attempt to write a mature story. Banana Fish, and yaoi as a whole, have been heavily scrutinized by Western and Japanese academics for its unrealistic approach to gay men and perversion of female sexuality. The debate is ongoing, but at the time it became part of a moral panic, with fans of the genre being labelled as disgusting women, or fujoshi. This era was known as the yaoi ronso, or yaoi debate, and had an impact on both artists and readers. For readers, it perpetuated the shame of female sexuality in a place where women had attempted to carve out a space where they could escape from the misogynistic society in which they lived. And for writers, they were scrutinized as perpetuating perversion and social decay. The feminist journal Choiseer was one such battleground of the yaoi ronso, with authors and writers regularly submitting statements on their side of the issue. Chiyo Kurihara moved from writing yaoi to plain hentai, citing that her previous work had been a form of escapism that no longer seem permissible in the face of her internalized misogyny. On the other hand, Hisaku Takamatsu, a reader of yaoi, spoke of her disgust with her sexuality as a woman, but reflected on how her desire to escape misogyny may have been inadvertently harming her perception of gay men. The whole debate in Chosei was started by Masaki Sato, a gay activist who condemned yaoi for being too perfect and barely a depiction of gay men. He saw yaoi fans as co-opting the struggles that he and other gay men of the time faced, and spoke over their self-made representation. Not to be too much of a centrist, but I think all three of them are somewhat correct. Sato is correct that if the only depictions of gay men are in unrealistic porn, then real gay men may have trouble relating and understanding their identity. Kurihara is correct that an obsession with yaoi can be a sign of internalized misogyny, and as artists, we have a responsibility in how we depict situations and peoples. And Takamatsu is correct that yaoi can provide an escape from personal sexuality, as well as that as readers, we should be aware of our perspectives becoming warped. Ultimately, yaoi isn't harmful in of itself, and can be a part of a healthy psychosexual development for men and women of varying sexualities. Any one manga also shouldn't be expected to be the pinnacle of morality. Media consumption, as with food, needs a balanced diet of various flavors, nutrients, and textures. Sato himself came to understand his initial anger at yaoi had not taken into consideration the perspectives of readers such as Takamatsu, or of the intersection between gay rights and feminism. This debate is in no way settled, and you can see these same cycles and arguments play out over and over and over in the comments section on Twitter and TikTok. So consider this aspect of the video a call out for those people in particular. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We can't keep reinventing decades-old discourse just with new terminology. You are complaining about issues on a device that could connect you to the works of dozens of people before you who have already thought this way. This video has a bibliography. You can start there. We've already tried to do some of the thinking for you, but that is only step one.
So in the early 2000s, yaoi became a much more global phenomenon. As well as seeing an increase in domestic popularity, despite the economic crisis of the time, yaoi not only increased in popularity with women all over the world, but also men. A lot of yaoi got official English translations, and the internet helped facilitate this spread both by exposing more people to it as a genre, but also allowing English-speaking and Japanese writers to create their own yaoi. Around this time we also see South Korea starting to build its own BL manhwa industry, which primarily existed online, where censorship and publication was a lot easier to navigate. Western fans also had discourse of their own, without the same prior social context that Japan had. Yaoi had accidentally stumbled into contemporary discourse on pornography and homophobia. Specifically, the emphasis on school settings and teenage boys led to concerns that yaoi counted as child porn, and would be illegal in certain countries. The debate of fetishization and appropriating gay men's experience was also present here, but from a different lens. Moral panic about gay men being pedophiles or targeting younger men meant that yaoi plots often came across as much more taboo and perpetuating the stereotype. Its existence was a big source of discourse, as depicting sex was seen as a cause of moral decay. Gay sex doubly morally dubious. Like, you can't even make babies with that type of sex.
Thing often discussed in relation to yaoi is how it's especially degenerate, emphasizing things like digital penetration and BDSM dynamics, which always comes across that either these academics haven't seen any straight porn or are over-exaggerating yaoi as being distinctly perverse. There are fetishes that exist somewhat exclusively to yaoi, but that could be said for Yuri, hentai, romance, and Western romances as well. For example, M-preg can't exactly exist without an M to preg. And a lot of the S&M play in yaoi that people were so shocked by often only existed as an extension of the Yuk-Semi divide. Wait, have I not explained Yuk and Semi yet? Yuk meaning defense and Semi meaning offense simply describes the top-bottom dichotomy, specifically in yaoi. However, both have certain codified characteristics, and in yaoi are often a discrete taxonomy that characters strictly abide by. There are characters that switch between these positions, known as switches, but generally you pick a role and stick with it. And by pick, I mean you're drawn to be a certain expression of the masculine or feminine. So we are once again back to being a bottom as being inherently feminine and topping as inherently masculine. Hooray! Semis tend to be older, successful, and have hands bigger than their torsos. They are tall and broad, but often not overtly muscular, so as to be attractive to a Japanese audience. Watch our video on Bishonen for more context there. Ukes tend to be younger, naive, of average height, and slender. In yaoi, you rarely see these rules being broken, and when they are, it's often a distinct separate dynamic based on the subversion. For instance, a tall muscular uke may play into concepts of humiliation and submission. However, the one place these tropes are most likely to be subverted is in bara. Bara, meaning rose, comes from the magazine Barazoku and was the oldest and longest running magazine in Japan aimed specifically at gay men, until its closure in 2008. Started by Bungaku Ito, a heterosexual man who saw a niche in the market for magazines aimed at gay men. The name was inspired by the Greek myth of Laos, the father of Oedipus. At one point in the myth, Laos kidnaps and rapes Chrysippus, the young son of King Pelops, who curses Laos to be killed by his own son as revenge. We all know how that ends. Despite the association with rape and pederasty, the name is a tongue-in-cheek reappropriation of bara, which was derogatory Japanese slang for gay men. Barazoku meaning the Rose Tribe. Despite being heterosexual, Ito brought on editors who were gay men and handled most of the content while he focused on the business, convincing mainstream shops to stock Barazoku and citing his previous successes with books aimed at gay men. Unlike yaoi, bara is made by men for men and emphasizes characteristics that are more appealing to a gay male audience. This was a very deliberate move by mangaka like Gengaro Tagame, who sought to move bara away from the idealized Bishonen aesthetic. His work focused on hypermasculine muscular men and took direct inspiration from Western bear culture. He submitted numerous works in numerous styles to magazines such as June and Barazoku before establishing his own magazine, G-Men. G-Men developed an aesthetic mostly based on Tagame's own personal tastes of bears and BDSM relationships, but also featured submissions of manga and literature from a wide variety of authors, as well as photography. G-Men ceased publication in 2016 after a 20-year run which saw over 240 volumes produced. At this time, Tagame had actually already been kicked out of the magazine for over a decade and instead focused on his own career as a solo mangaka, producing a gay manga for a wider audience. You may have heard of a little manga known as My Brother's Husband. Tagame had been reluctant to veer into general manga, but the lack of representation of married gay men in Japan motivated him to create a sincere depiction of homophobia and marriage inequality. My Brother's Husband was a success with both Japanese and Western critics who noted it as a departure from the typical yaoi bishonen. In the West, bara is often used as a term for a specific style of depicting gay men, and has been out of fashion amongst mangaka since the turn of the millennium. Gay authors instead use loanwords such as gay, and some gay mangaka take issue with bara as a term due to personal interpretations of the word, such as its association with the Bishonen of Barazoku and its historical use as a slur. Bara as a term does have value to Western audiences of yaoi, mostly in denoting manga that is made by gay Japanese men or depicting more varied body types. However, understanding that these terms are not universal and may have differing meanings or connotations is equally valuable to know. Similarly, fujoshi and fudanshi are commonplace in anime nowadays and are presented with a lot less disgust than they used to be. Now they're just as weird as any other otaku. A good example would be Chika Komari and Koto Tsukunoki from Makane, Too Many Losing Heroines. They openly talk about enjoying yaoi, and while it's treated as a joke, it's not derogatory. Shonenai is also a mostly Western used term, and tended to be used to distinguish romantic yaoi from sexual yaoi, often for manga and anime that had only subtextual homoeroticism, and would otherwise be grouped in with the more textual examples. It fell out of use in the 2010s, but can still be found out in the wild on less official sites. Also, by the way, why does Crunchyroll have only 15 genres to choose from? I get too much choice can be overwhelming, but not even a vague LGBT section? No josei? No horror? This makes me so annoyed. Annoyed enough to make an entire new
The 2010s saw BL become even more global with specific industries in Thailand and China. In Thailand, BL is often web novels or live action, and actors are often elevated to K-pop inspired idols. Dramas centering on BL are a massive part of Thai film and TV. Although there is backlash from conservatives in Thailand, the proliferation has done a lot to normalize homosexuality. This adoption of openly gay stories may have helped push Thailand to being the first country in Southeast Asia to legalize gay marriage. Colloquially, BL stories in Thailand are often described as Y series, with the Y standing for yaoi, and often denotes it being made for a more female audience. Chinese danmei has a far more precarious place in its country's media, being somewhat in a grey area for censorship as pornography is outright banned along with homosexuality. Many danmei websites were shut down over the years, and several authors have been fined and jailed for their work. The desires to make a profit and the desires for social control often lead to danmei utilizing queerbaiting and implying gay relationships with no intent to ever realize them. Damn it, I said this wasn't going to be about danmei. Hit the mic, great. South Korea has an above average level of discrimination compared to other developed countries, and while it has no general sodomy laws, they do exist specifically for the military. Korean culture has also not had the same level of prevalence of homosexuality as Japan, but has had similar forms of temporary homosexuality, such as between nobles in the Silla dynasty, and with kings taking young boys as lovers. Until 1998, portraying homosexuality in films was illegal, and following this ban being lifted, several popular films about homosexual relationships were created. More recently, Korean TV has also embraced homosexual stories, but most LGBT media is still found online. Webcomic platforms often feature BL, with Leshin in particular having a focus on BL.
Is this segment here so I can recommend all my favourite yaoi memoir? Yes. But it's also interesting to see the global impact of yaoi and how different countries' pre-existing LGBT cultures have responded to it. As with Japan, China, Korea, and Thailand, BL media has received criticism for fetishizing gay men and misrepresenting the authentic experience of actual homosexuals. But also, it's a flourishing industry that appeals to female sexuality and has its place in media. This is an intensely studied topic, and we could go so much deeper into the specific issues and characteristics of yaoi, but this will do for a brief history. On to the recommendations. Where do I begin? I think a yaoi that has a more general appeal would be best for a first recommendation. Something that's mild, but has a good solid plot most people could enjoy. MADK.
Mitsuya Sensei no Keikakuteki na Edsuke, or this manga by Matsumoto Ayaka, is an adorable story of a newspaper editor scoring an interview with a famous chef who just so happens to be an utter silver fox. It's adorably sweet. The romance progresses at such a nice, brisk pace. It's a shame they introduce a past lover to add drama towards the end, because to be honest, I could read about these two flirting and eating meals together for ages. It's really nice to see a story about all the characters falling in love over time. It's only 12 chapters, and it's just such a cute romance that happens to be about two men.
But also, MADK is great if you like cannibalism and surprisingly interesting world building. The art is clean, but at other times almost too messy to read, which only adds to its ephemeral charms. You guys have to read it because my friend was too squeamish for it, and I need more people to know how amazing this manga is. It's the polar opposite of the cute cooking romance, so pick your poison, sweet or bloody. Now if I had to pick one BL memoir to recommend, it would have to be Murderous Llewellyn's Candlelit Dinner, a thriller that was so good a yaoi-obsessed friend of mine describes it as really good even though they don't fuck. This is the highest honour a series can be bestowed.
Stop looking at me like that, I'll finish it eventually.
Whoo boy, that was a lot of words. Took a lot of time too. Unpaid time. Time that could be making us money. If only you had supported us on Patreon and gotten access to this video early, work in progress videos, a resource for assets we use in the videos, and many other nice things. But you didn't, and now we have wasted away, we have died, and the Yuri will have to wait another 4 months.
Money makes life happy.
What?
3.
Patreon? I'll tell the men the Yuri's back on!
You would think that Yuri, as with yaoi, would be created by the people most likely to be attracted to women. Straight men. And that was the impression we had going into our research. Cute girls who barely do anything sexual and conform to an outsider's view of what lesbian sex is, with no input from gay women. It's worth noting that as we often used gay or homosexual for the yaoi section, we will also be using homosexual, gay, or lesbian for the yuri section. We're aware this does not include the nuance of bisexuals, and instead is describing the relationships of these people and not their identities. This is purely for the sake of ease, because saying WLW or women loving women is just tricky. Some of these characters may be bi or have dated men, but the focus is on their relationships with women. Recently, there's been a few interesting controversies in the yuri sphere. The manga Love Bullet by Ini was heavily pushed in online Western spaces as it was possibly about to be cancelled. The unique plot and tendency for Yuri to undersell led to Western fans mass buying the first volume to prove that Yuri is a viable genre. Another case was Hana Monogatari by Schwinn, which had the artist asking fans to read their manga even if it was on illegal sites, because the editors had given the series no marketing, dooming it to fail. Why is the yuri market so much smaller than yaoi? With men making up such a large demographic of manga readers, this should be the more popular of the two. But it isn't. Maybe we can find some clues as to why in its history. But first, what is a yuri?
Yuri also goes by shoujo ai, GL, and girls love, and is a generally younger set of terms, but it still has an interesting etymology. Yuri was initially used as a companion term to bara in barazoku, specifically for female readers of the magazine. Some of these women were lesbians, and others just appreciated men, but this is what caused the association of Yuri, meaning lily, and lesbians. The magazine Alan, which had a focus on gay men, also used Yuri to refer to their personal ad column for lesbians. The lily has historically been a flower representing purity, which will tie into a lot of Yuri concepts, but we'll get to that in a bit. In the 1990s, Japan and the West saw Yuri as pornographic depictions of lesbian relationships for a male audience. This led to shoujo ai being coined by Western fans to distinguish the less sexual works, much as shonen ai had done for yaoi. In general, Yuri ran about a decade or so behind yaoi in terms of popularity, and so most of the terms were gender-swapped versions of the pre-existing masculine terms. In Japanese, the term shoujo ai has a much more common meaning of older men attracted to young girls, and also a far more unethical connotation, more similar to lolicon, and so is not used for lesbian media in Japan. Garuzurabu, the transliteration of the translation of shoujo ai, does not have this same connotation, because loanwords are just like that. Much how if you ask for a latte in a Spanish-speaking country, you're more likely to get a glass of milk than a heavily milk-based coffee, because of the implications. Around the 2000s, we see magazines adopting the term girls love, such as in comic Yuri Hime and Yuri Shimai. The 2000s also saw girls love and GL being used by Western manga publishers as a parallel to their BL genres. However, the two terms are mostly interchangeable, with mild variations. Some people see GL as more explicit and Yuri as more romantic, which is interesting because I always saw it as the opposite personally. Western publishers also mostly stuck to using Yuri as the genre, although 7Cs for some reason called their line of girl-on-girl manga Strawberry? It's not even a flower. Stick with the theme, damn it.
While reading Yuri for research purposes, I came across a newer girls love manga published by 7Cs, and now it seems they use both girls love or Yuri and do in fact use the lily in their designs. Good job, guys.
Korea and China also borrowed Yuri as the term for homoerotic media about gay women, with the Korean being baekap and Chinese being baihei. These are both just the language's respective terms for lily. Oh, and of course, we can't forget about Class S.
Yuri as a literary concept began in the 1930s and was commonly written by women, often focusing on temporary lesbianism as a stage of psychosexual development. These were tragic stories with a definitive endpoint when the girls became women, often going on to marry men and have children. At this time, it was called Class S, with the S meaning anything from sex to shoujo to shon, the German word for beautiful. Although a lot of these relationships were not sexual and often blurred the line between platonic and romantic types of love. The early 1900s saw a lot of popular Western novels of the 1800s getting translated into Japanese. Books like Little Women and A Little Princess, which had a heavy emphasis on girlhood and becoming a woman, appealing to Japanese women and inspiring the works they would go on to write and read. An increase in all-girls schools supposedly popularized the Class S genre, but was that because it sparked the imagination of male writers? Or the women getting into this this type of relationship. These stories were often set in all-girls boarding schools, which provided the ideal excuse for lonely girls with only other girls to lean on, but also perhaps because these women were drawing on their own experiences as youths for their writing. It's hard to separate what was a reflection of these individual women's struggles with attraction to women and what was a reflection of 1920s Japanese societal views on sexuality as a whole. Sadly, the genre was short-lived, so we may never know, as post-war censorship was enacted on not just Class S, but heterosexual romance as well, and wiped out a large proportion of the country's magazines and newspapers. This 1936 enactment of censorship resulted in thousands of arrests and assassinations of government personnel. Communism, the rape of Nanking, and antisocial behaviour were all targets of the committee. It was never specifically about Class S, but more that nothing except the most tightly controlled media was allowed to exist. This not only affected the media, but the people of Japan who were cut off from anything except state-owned media.
As Yuri is a genre heavily focused on lesbianism, it's important to consider the actual history of lesbians in Japan. Unlike gay men, gay women had much less presence in historical Japanese culture. Lacking the structure of nanshoku and wakashu, they often went unseen. Lesbians of course would have existed at all times throughout history in all countries, but their struggles and existence is far less documented. What art there was fetishistic and often for a male gaze. This has been theorized to be due to a lack of education for women, so while we may have primary sources from homosexual men, it would take much longer for homosexual women to be able to say their piece. The few women that were able to write, such as Murasaki Shikibu, were of the aristocracy and had privileges and experiences that commoners did not. However, it's worth noting that her work The Tale of Genji is actually written entirely in hiragana in the original form. For those unaware, hiragana is the alphabet in Japanese made of plain phonetic characters, and is used for the parts of Japanese not borrowed and adapted from Chinese. To understand Japanese, both are needed, but you can write only in hiragana. But unfortunately, this strips a lot of the meaning from the words, as you don't know the exact form being used. The reason Murasaki wrote like this was because the simpler syllabary was seen as more fitting for women. Expecting them to learn all that kanji was asking far too much of their little women brains. Ironically, this combined with the archaic Japanese of the time makes it incredibly hard for contemporary Japanese people to understand it. It's kind of like trying to parse Shakespeare or the Canterbury Tales if they were also written in medieval kiddie speak. But the increase in literacy amongst women of the 1800s is what gave rise to the Class S genre. Nobuko Yoshie was a prominent lesbian novelist of the 20th century, which is to say she was a writer of lesbian stories, and was also actually a lesbian herself, being in a 50-year relationship with a woman she adopted, but we'll get to that concept in a bit. During her childhood, education was only mandatory for the 6 years of elementary education, and her father thought her having anything further would make her an unsuitable bride. Despite this, she was able to build her own income through her writing and lived as a single woman in her 20s. Very unusual at the time. Besides this strange lifestyle, she also adopted the tomboyish fashion and hairstyle of American flappers in a shocking display of androgyny. She began her career submitting short stories to girls' magazines like Shoujo Kai and Shoujo Sekai from the young age of 12, escalating to more prestigious magazines such as Bunsho Sekai by her late teens. Yoshie's Hana Monogatari were a series of 52 stories published across 8 years in the Class S genre, and were often fantasy as well as romance. While she frequently wrote about lesbianism as a temporary phase, her works heavily emphasized that these female-female relationships were highly important and to be expected. As a somewhat closeted lesbian, her frequent depiction of tragic endings for her heroines, who often committed double suicide, could be seen as her own way of coming to terms with the expectations of marriage and motherhood. Either physically or metaphorically, some part of her would have to die. She was 20 to 28 during this period of her work, but it was towards the end of this period that she would meet her lifelong girlfriend Chiyo Monma. They had a collaborative relationship, with Monma acting as Yoshie's secretary, keeping their romantic relationship to themselves. This allowed her a reason and the space to support Monma, which wasn't hard considering she was the most prolific and well-paid author of her day. Her work of this time became more platonic than romantic, which allowed her to circumvent the censorship of perverse relationships in wartime Japan. She used her earnings to build an entire house for her and Monma to live in, and this allowed her to declare the home legally as a household, and thus create a household register. By law, these had to include all members of the family, be that due to marrying into, adopted into, born into, or dying out of the household. This rule of adoption allowed Yoshia to formally adopt Monma and enter her into this household registry. As kin, they would have legal protections of inheritance and medical decisions, as with any husband and wife. Because of this, it was a practice common with same-sex relationships at the time. The two lived a long and happy life, even if it was at the expense of some social ridicule. Their relationship was only halted by Nobuko's passing at 77 years old. I can only make assumptions, but I hope that towards the end of her life, she fought upon the 20-year-old Nobuko, who couldn't imagine life as a loving wife, and realized how wrong she'd been. The span of Nobuko Yoshia's life saw immense societal change for women and lesbians, but not enough that they were totally free of discrimination. Despite being considered a renaissance of the genre, the 70s and 80s actually saw very little Yuri manga being published, and returned to the trope of tragedy, but this time for melodrama and shock. A lot of this manga was still created by women, for women, and also played with gender expectations alongside lesbian relationships. Shiroi Heia no Futari is often considered the first Yuri manga. Published in Ribbon Comic Magazine, it was directly inspired by the homosexual tambi works of Mari Mori. The name even borrows from a popular work by Mori, Amai Mitsuno Heia. However, due to her own discomfort with enjoying yaoi as something perverse, she instead decided to write a manga about two girls. Shiroi borrows a lot of the classic Class S features. It's set in an all-girls school, specifically in France, utilizes cross-dressing, and ends in tragedy when one of the girls is unable to deal with the social stigma of being in a relationship with a woman. The other then encourages a man to kill her as life is not worth living now she's been rejected. We can also see even more minute tropes being established. A hot-headed black-haired character and a shy, naive blonde girl, a masculine girl and a feminine girl, playing into some elements of heteronormativity, but progressive nonetheless. At least by 1970s Japan standards. Look, she's wearing trousers. Using a play as an excuse to put the two girls in the role of a boy and a girl, culminating in a kiss, the more masculine woman being the one implied to be a real lesbian and taking advantage of a pure feminine girl. Even things like the living girl declaring celibacy as a way to opt out of being a lesbian beyond that temporary girlhood affair, but still implying her feelings may have been true love. There just was no other girl. It was just that one. That one girl was so pretty, so special, so lovely, as to turn her heart for a moment and leave it bruised forever. But she's totally not a lesbian.
A big influence on the genre was the Takarazuka Revue. This was an all-female theatre troupe that had been around since 1913, and would often utilize cross-dressing to depict male characters. Takarazuka performed a lot of shows that would go on to directly influence Yuri manga with their Rose of Versailles and Shangri-La performances, as well as general cross-dressing influencing the creation of Princess Knight and the Rose of Versailles. Both massive shoujo manga that popularized a lot of the themes we see today, with manga like The Guy She Was Interested In Wasn't a Guy at All, and Handsome Girl and Sheltered Girl. Even the play in Shirohei no Furai, Romeo and Juliet, is popular with Takarazuka, having performed it a half-dozen times over the years, with a good few being in the 1970s around the time the manga was written. The troupe still has an influence on Yuri today, with the majority of their audience being women who are attracted to the masculinity, for gender and sexuality reasons, and have had collaborations with Ace Attorney and Lupin III. That last bit isn't relevant, but it is cool. Temporary homosexuality, compulsory heterosexuality, and collectivist thinking, that often force lesbians to marry men and have children, hiding their sexuality forever, are considered potential reasons for the slow growth of Yuri manga in the 1970s and 80s. Women were unable to confront their own sexuality, or were unaware lesbianism was even an option. If marriage is a social contract, where love is coincidental, it can be hard to tell if you don't like your husband because you're incompatible, or because he isn't a woman. While Class S and Yuri depicted lesbian relationships as legitimate, the fact they were temporary could often leave young women confused as to why they weren't growing out of it, like normal women did. The 1990s coincided with the increased visibility of LGBT people in Japan, which in turn led to more magazines for lesbians and bisexual women, several decades after magazines for gay and bisexual men. Lesbians of the time saw conflict with feminists of the time, who felt their attraction to women as inherently masculine and therefore predatory. The diminution of female sexuality as non-existent or more pure than male sexuality also meant that a lot of lesbian relationships were viewed as lesser than heterosexual or male homosexual relationships, due to a perceived absence of sex. No need to create for an audience that doesn't exist. Despite this, some of the most iconic Yuri relationships emerged in shoujo, namely the relationship between Haruka Tenno and Michiru Kaio in Sailor Moon. Despite international censorship, the relationship was seen as a positive and nice move away from the tragic fate of the Class S girls. This pairing also created a boom in Yuri doujinshi, and would popularize Yuri as a genre in general. Sailor Moon's popularity as a show in and of itself cannot be understated, as it helped pave the way for Yuri as a commercially viable element of anime and manga. However, this would often fall into queerbaiting territory by only utilizing fan service with no intent to realize these relationships. The level of sexuality depicted varied from yearning to kissing to sleeping in the same bed, and so by the early 2000s, Yuri was very much on the same flat level as Yaoi in terms of use and content. Enough time had passed that the need to distinguish romantic or sexual Yuri was no longer worthwhile and was a case of personal taste. As with gay men's magazines, women's magazines would host lifestyle tips and photography. These magazines were explicitly for lesbians and not for people who were into women, focusing on developing a community of like-minded women and allowing them to meet up and form relationships through personal columns and classified ads. The early 2000s saw the rise of the internet, which caused a lot of the community aspects of these magazines to necrotize. These superfluous limbs rotted away and became replaced by more manga or even nothing at all, with the magazines of all types being on the decline. Magazines would thus have to innovate on the format, and one such magazine was Camilla, which heavily focused on sex compared to other lesbian magazines. The magazine was started by Inoue Memi, a lesbian who wanted to create something different than what was currently on the market. The name being borrowed from the novel of the same name by Sheridan Le Fanu, which depicts a vampire, Camilla, preying on a young woman. For Inoue, this novel was her first introduction to lesbian sex as a teenager. Her sexuality was heavily explored by male-made media, and so she wanted to create a magazine similar to what she had enjoyed in her youth. Because of this, Camilla was very much expected to have a heterosexual male audience as well as a lesbian one. She considered this a good thing because they shared attraction to women, and it also helped fund the magazine. Inoue took a very casual approach to Camilla, wanting to emphasize the fun of sexuality instead of entering into debates and serious discussions. She also directed and wrote scripts for live-action lesbian pornography. Her approach to her work was often pragmatic, focusing on commercial viability. This led to Camilla being criticized for reaffirming harmful stereotypes of lesbian sex, such as appealing to the male gaze and glamorizing the exploitation of women.
I agree with Inoue that there's a place for this type of lesbian media as much as there is for magazines focusing more on social progression and acceptance. You could also argue that her focus on female sexuality is just as progressive a viewpoint, considering the aforementioned compat and dismissal of women as sexual creatures.
This era also saw more of the typical Yuri conventions develop. School settings, one-sided longings, and super slow burn relationships. Probably stemming from their origins in shoujo magazines, Yuri's stories tend to follow the tried and tested formula of incredibly slow but satisfying relationships, lingering on the minutiae of life and focusing on specific relationship drama. Although, Yuri manga often didn't get the runtime of heterosexual romance, with most manga barely breaking 10 chapters. Maybe it's because I'm older now, archaic and crumbling at 26, but the Yuri I like tends to be josei. I enjoy reading about adults going about their daily lives, falling in love and realistically dealing with the issues that surround being gay in Japan. One trope I've noticed for Yuri josei is that one of the characters will be married to a man, and her lesbian relationship will be based on infidelity. It feels like it's depicting the aftermath of what the earlier shoujo Yuri writers were worried about. What happens to those women who disregard their sexuality and marry a man? Downside is, I'm not for that drama, so I don't tend to enjoy that aspect of these stories much, but they are an interesting reaction to that heteronormativity. In terms of official publishing, there is less of an equivalent to Bara. That is to say, Yuri made by lesbians for lesbians. Of course, there is Yuri made by women, because statistically, the majority of mangaka are women, but as a lot of mangaka work under pen names, it can be hard to get meaningful figures. Sexuality is even more tricky for the same reasons, plus the addition of societal judgment. In the West, a lot of the praise for LGBT media comes from a desire for authenticity that often leads communities to scrutinize the gender and sexuality of its creators, often to the detriment of all involved. This is less of a concern in Japan.
The 2010s would see a rise in the accessibility of online mediums for self-publishing, namely web novels and web manga. This is also an era of diversification, with Yuri becoming more of a co-genre, appearing alongside other genres like isekai. There are so many villainess Yuri. Interestingly, there's actually a lot of European influence in isekais, often being heavily based on that sort of medieval Franco-British Germanic thing. So I could see why you would think of Yuri when it comes to those stereotypical settings. And it brings us back to those classic Class S locations. While Yuri still lacks the overt sexuality afforded to yaoi manga, there are manga with similar ratios of sex to plot. Asumi-chan is interested in lesbian brothels comes to mind as one that balances the explicit sex with an actual good amount of plot. There are some academic discussions of Yuri, but it's more a discussion of general female sexuality. This is possibly due to the extensive dismissal of female sexuality as even being a thing, and so there was less discourse around it as a topic compared to yaoi. While researching this section, I definitely felt I had to delve a lot deeper to get some interesting facts and to fill in certain gaps. The things I do for you, dear listeners. So, onto the recommendations. I'm not so well informed in the ways of Yuri, so I decided to read quite a few Yuri manga to find something good to recommend. Of course, I've read things like My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, and it really has some fascinating relevancy to both Yuri and Yaoi, but that's a basic answer, everyone's heard of that, so I'd rather explore it in the conclusion. Scarlet by Chiri Yuino is a dark fairy tale style manga about a vampire and Little Red Riding Hood. It's only 11 chapters long, but the story was really cute and, wait a minute, cannibalism, homoerotic tension, dark fantasy? This is just Yuri MADK, goddammit. Look, I'm allowed to have personal taste.
My recommendation is slightly cuter. She Loves to Cook and She Loves to Eat is a manga by Sakaomi Yazuki, an adult romance for adults. God, it's good. Before romance, the manga focuses on food and different people's relationship with it, specifically how women are expected to behave around food. As a guy, society expects me to eat a lot, so when I do, I've succeeded my social obligation. But what if, like Totoko Kasuga, you're a woman who likes to eat? Or what if, like Yuki Nomoto, you have a small appetite and love cooking, but hate the way society views that passion as something to be done for a man? Well, you have a woman who loves to cook and a woman who loves to eat, with a slow but super satisfying love blooming between them. The manga also features Sena Nagumo, who has a phobia of eating in public, and Kaname Yako, a woman who loves to eat but hates to cook. The manga builds its cast of characters so gently and realistically that when it starts dealing with sexuality and the societal issues that come with it, you're already primed and so are the characters. It's a fantastic read, but it's ongoing, so look forward to suffering as I have suffered waiting for new chapters.
So that was the entire history of Yaoi and Yuri, give or take a few years. It's an interesting history and one worthy of analysis and understanding its place in the modern anime landscape. Personally, it had an incredibly deep impact on my adolescence, and so I wanted to treat it as the complex and varying topic that it is. And as with all things I love, I want to cut it up and dissect it into little pieces and then reassemble them into conclusions and analysis. The biggest question I came out with from all of this research is, how can we best approach Yaoi and Yuri as varying individuals of sexuality and genders? In particular, Fujoshi, Fudenshi, Himajoshi, and Himadanshi led me to consider this multiple axes of Yaoi and Yuri fans based on gender and preference. It's basically a rough structure for this section that I'll immediately forget to follow. So let's start with the Fujoshis, the rotten girls who can't find husbands because of their unlovable traits of enjoying men kissing other men. As we've already discussed, the morality of the Fujoshi has been a hotly debated topic, but there's one element we've missed. You would think the Fujoshi market is entirely straight and bisexual women, but there's an entirely different demographic at play. In My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness, Eita Kabi is incredibly sincere with her depiction of her struggles with self-harm, eating disorders, and coming to terms with being a lesbian. But one thing that stood out to me when I first read it was that she only ever read yaoi manga before realizing she was gay. This did give her a misinformed understanding of sex, but she also reflects on the fact that it's the only sort of fantasy she allowed herself, one entirely separate from women. A similar reason to why straight women might enjoy yaoi, but from a completely different angle. A common theme in My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness is that Kabi never got the skills she needed to function in society from that same society. Part of that was the absence of good sex ed and the idea that women could date other women. However, she herself doesn't deride finding solace in yaoi and accepts it as part of the journey it took her to discover her sexuality. That safe playground of the imagination allowed both distance and closeness with sex until she was able to come to understand herself. There's an interesting trope in Yaoi and Yuri, where if a straight couple has one of the characters discovering they're gay, the other partner also ends up being gay. And so you end up with a lesbian and a gay couple. Depending on if it's Yuri or Yaoi, one will be the main focus, but this trope of pairing up the leftovers always intrigued me. On one hand, it at least presents the idea that compulsory heterosexuality is not gendered, but equally that there is little room in these narratives for straight or bisexual characters. Of course I get it, you're reading Yaoi or Yuri, so why would there be? But also then, why is it always two gay couples as the outcome? If I had to throw in a guess, it's because there's a lot of overlap between Fujos and Himis, but equally it removes a lot of the drama. No one gets spurned and everyone fits into neat little relationships. Kameno's video on bisexuality in manga always bounces around my head at times like this. I've read some more recent yaoi where characters identify as bisexual, such as Saito from Kaisuru Tetsumenpai, but it definitely feels like there is gay manga and straight manga, and I think this can have negative effects on not just bisexual readers, but people of any sexuality. The solution to this is just to have more manga with bisexual characters, because the more variety, the better. But that's easier said than done. It would also be nice to see LGBT characters have more of a place in mainstream heterosexual romance manga.
I can't for the life of me remember its name, but I read a romance manga that had a side plot with the main character's brother coming to terms with his sexuality. It was perfectly woven into the themes of the main heterosexual romance and was a great addition. Fudanshis are often pegged as gay or bi men because, as far as most people are concerned, it's gay to enjoy stories about a man being in love with another man. That just isn't the case and shouldn't be how it's viewed. And yes, finding identity and representation in fiction is positive, but equally, why deny yourself art because you think you aren't the right sort of person to enjoy it? For a start, what if you're wrong about who you are? But secondly, what if you aren't? What if you know who you are and are open and willing to fiction of all kinds, and through it discover worlds you never knew could exist? Works of art that can touch your heart in ways you never expected. There tends to be an issue in general with young men not being willing to engage with romantic media. For instance, the strange reaction to Momo and Okuran's budding relationship in Dandadan. Men's media is often devoid of romance. Shonen will time skip and have two people who barely liked each other have two kids together. In these stories, marriage and children is just something that happens to men. Why do they bother with it at all? Even when it's specifically a shonen romance, if it gets too romantic, the boys will complain. I have an example that really annoyed me actually. In Komi Can't Communicate, midway through the manga, the tone shifts from a comedy focus with a side of romance to a romance focus with a side of comedy. It garnered so much criticism from the male audience who didn't enjoy the change. Myself excluded, I loved it. I wish more men explored outside their comfort zones with the media they consume. Most men are so catered to when it comes to their media that they don't need to engage with anything except what they're told is for them. We asked some gay friends on Tumblr if they read yaoi and the general consensus was no, with some not reading romance at all. When they did, it was bara or had an overlap with a separate genre. Perhaps we would have more male-made yaoi if more men were willing to be fudanshis. Or fans of romance full stop.
Himojoshi and Himodanshi are interesting because they aren't as popular in anime and manga communities in the West. Himojoshis are mostly, but not exclusively, gay women. It's not so flat though. As with yaoi, there is no reason to cut yourself off from good stories just because you personally don't want to experience the type of relationship in it. Gay people can equally enjoy heterosexual stories because the point of a story isn't to find a character that is 100% you. Personally, I've been trying to read more Yuri and straight romances, because I really only read yaoi. My process has always been to search the yaoi plus psychological tags and then read everything in order of most to least unpopular. Just searching psychological was genuinely a case of me broadening my horizons. And the only reason my anime list profile lists boys love as my 5th most read genre is only because they don't have the 100 or so trashy BL memoir I've burned through. Also, I made it last month, so it's missing a lot of things that made no impact on my psyche. Yaoi was definitely easier to read, and as a teen I tended to lean towards it because of the absence of women. As someone attracted to women, there was a certain sense of shame to enjoying lesbian media. Even straight romance kinda squicked me out, because one's self-confidence also plays into this, and for a long time in my life I was not comfortable viewing myself as a being with sexuality. But even cutting out 2 of the 3 options, I still found enough to keep me occupied for a decade or so. BL is disproportionately represented in the manga world. If it was a case of attraction to women, we would expect to see GL be much larger, because as the majority of women are attracted to men, the majority of men are attracted to women. But because women are the key readers of any sort of romance, we actually see romance manga skew heavily to what appeals to women.
As we discussed in the Yuri section, Yuri is predominantly made by women, for women, and is predominantly read by women. So like, aside from me, What percentage of men even consume romantic media? We know it's not a lot, but in the group of men who do enjoy romance as a genre, how many even read manga? And then, how many of them go out of their way to find Yuri stories? If they wanted to fetishize lesbians, they could just watch lesbian porn. A lot of men just aren't comfortable reading romantic media.
When you consider how horny your typical yaoi manga is, it becomes complicated. Unlike Yuri, which tends to be only romance and so appeals to just romance fans, a lot of yaoi is romance and smart, so appeals to both markets of horny and non-horny women. Of course, some people will be put off by one half or the other, but it's definitely a broader market, and the audience as a whole expects some even if it's a primarily romance manga. Just look at the book Talk Girls if you want another example of this same market. Women actually expect sex in their media, and in these heavily female-led subcultures, they get it. Yaoi, fanfiction, Mills and Boon, they're all full of f***ing. This even spills into Yuri, with many of the manga made by women featuring sex scenes.
I guarantee I will see a comment under this video saying something along the lines of, "I'm a guy and I read Yuri." And that's great. Assuming it's not just to watch two girls kiss, why do you read it? Is it about engaging in media without men? Do you view it as somehow more pure than heterosexual or gay romance? Or maybe it's more about gender and finding yourself relating to female protagonists more? I am seriously lacking data on this one, so feel free to comment down below. Part of this void, aside from the smaller fanbase, is that unlike Fujoshis, Himadanshis don't label themselves as Yuri fans. I think this is because men and women tend to express themselves differently, or maybe it's better to say there's broadly masculine and feminine methods of expression. In feminine methods, people tend to create identity around the terminology of being a fan, while the more masculine equivalent is an unsaid sense of community based on rules and displays of fandom. Check out our video on women in fandoms for more on this idea if you're interested. But what about me? Why do I, as a guy, read Yuri? I like Yuri stories because I love romance, and I'm always looking for interesting stories regardless of the sexuality of the characters. I like reading about different people's perspectives and how their lived experience affects their lives and how they view the world. Manga like My Brother's Husband and She Loves to Cook and She Loves to Eat left a profound impact on me after reading them.
And yet, you haven't finished Murderous Llewellyn's Candlelit Dinner. Fake romance fan. A common theme with these terms is how they're often contentious in their niche communities. Some lesbians find the concept of a himojoshi gross, and this is often because of its adjacency to anime fandom, which is seen as inherently deviant or indicative of certain personalities and behaviors. That's something that always catches us off guard, because to us, anime is always just there as an incredibly varied medium of animation, but to other people it's all tentacle porn and panty shots. It's also very odd seeing gay people looking for quote-unquote good Yuri, or pure yaoi, or even LGBT anime that isn't that gross BL or GL stuff, because it's all BL and GL. It's like asking for horror movies that aren't all that gross gore. You're not looking for just any horror movie, you're looking for a subgenre, or maybe even something that just fits your personal taste. Throwing out the whole genre won't help you there. It's sort of like if people judge the concept of TV shows entirely off of things like Naked Attraction and Teen Wolf. They're just catering to a different audience. A problem is that until recently, anime in the West was such a niche hobby that people tended to watch any anime they could get their hands on. So your average anime fan would have a very broad range of shows under their belt, including ecchi trash. Now people are spoiled for choice, and can develop subcultures within the overarching anime fandom. You've got Fujos, Shonen Bros, Shoujosei gals, casual enjoyers of anything that's on Netflix, and so on. This also means a lot of the language and behavior of older fans is becoming less used or known. A big tenet of our channel is keeping those terms alive and in use, because they have value to creating a universal lexicon for fans. Even just knowing what the ecchi genre is.
Wait, sudden round of weeb word of the day. Ecchi is the Japanese pronunciation for the English letter H, and in Japanese is used interchangeably with hentai, with ecchi being an abbreviation of the former. It's less used in Japan, with ero or 18 kin meaning forbidden for under 18s being more common. However, in the Western anime community, ecchi is specifically softcore, with hentai being porn, so you'll often come across it being used as a descriptor. And if you don't know the context, you won't understand what you're being warned about. Kinda like how until you obsessively read the BBFC's entire website, you'll never truly understand what makes a 12 versus a 12A or what mild peril is. So similarly, if you don't know what yaoi or BL is, if someone recommends you something in that genre, you might get penis jump scared. Even something being classified as shonen or shoujo will indicate certain tropes. In the same way that reading a young adult's book and then complaining that all the protagonists are teenagers makes you seem uninformed. Watching yaoi and then complaining there are boys kissing makes you seem hilariously uninformed. In particular, I've noticed a lot of people will be okay with himojoshis but not himodanshis, even if they don't have the same lexicon, because it falls under a more general concept of media focusing on lesbians and media focusing on gay men. This is heavily rooted in misogyny and homophobia, where a woman is seen as inherently asexual or having a more pure relationship to sex. But as we keep mentioning, that is absolutely not the case.
When women are seen enjoying lesbian media, there's often this view of how it's different to men's attraction, and that difference always ends up meaning not sexual, or sexual in an okay way. We see the other side of this when Inoue Mimi spoke about how her attraction to women is masculine, because of how focused on sex it is. Yuri itself often uses the same approach to female sexuality, emphasized by the lily being used, which is a symbol of purity, with the white lily in particular meaning chastity. This is often why Yuri manga may only depict romance. That is the ideal socially acceptable expression of a woman's sexuality. However, men are supposed to want sex. This is equally able to have a negative skew though. It's very common in yaoi for the characters to have sex long before they get together, and plays heavily into rape being something enjoyable for men because they always want sex, and saying no is just being coy. No often does not mean no in these stories, and that's fine as narrative dressing. As we mentioned, in fiction, no action is immoral or illegal because no one's being hurt. But when this goes out of the realm of imagination, it can cause damage to real people. This damage is often aimed more at people reading the content going on to do these things, but the idea of attacking someone for what they read is equally a form of damage. Assuming someone's a danger based on the fiction they like can lead to targeted harassment, such as with people online attacking fujoshis, but can also encourage censorship. Just because you talk about how you believe yaoi is gross for fetishizing gay men, that doesn't mean you aren't aligning yourself with homophobes who also see gay media as inherently problematic. In even more severe cases, it can become a prejudice used against people suspected of being criminals. For instance, the disgraced lawyer Jack Thomas regularly cited playing video games as being a cause of school shootings and other violent crime, to the point of attempting to build a criminal profile around this prejudice over the DC sniper attacks of 2002. Incorrectly. In reality, the shooters had motives entirely separate to video games. Obviously, that's the extreme end of things, but in day-to-day life, how often do we make associations with how a person might behave based on their media habits? Considering fans of reality TV shows as shallow and obsessive, fans of horror as potential murderers and antisocial, anime fans as unhygienic and virgins, when in reality what you enjoy in fiction has no definite bearing on who you are as a person.
In conclusion, this topic is absolutely massive. We barely scratched the surface of even the resources we referenced. Researching this topic has really expanded my appreciation for the people who've carved out a space for themselves in an environment that hasn't been kind to them, reading their stories and if only partially understanding how they felt while making their art. But what's the point of this art, you may be asking? Well, that's varied. Some stories aim to evoke joy, others horror, some thought, and some just plain entertainment. Some stories aim to teach us things about ourselves or other people, and so many are written by those seeking to understand themselves and the world around them. Every story contains a million granules of a dozen sand dunes that make up what a person is and has experienced. To approach all of these with one thought process makes very little sense.
The manga Suimo Amaimo is a BL about two retired 60-somethings who reflect on their relationship and what it means to be an older gay man in Japan. View no Oto Bokoku no Kami is about a guy getting fucked by a dragon. Despite both potentially being able to be described as old man yaoi, they're both trying to do very different things. Smamo is realistic and sincere, and the dragon fucking one does legitimately go into some interesting concepts of belief and immortality, but in a less emotional way. It's more for melodrama. Knowing roughly what to expect helps you know what to get out of something. For instance, take this video, a brief history of Yaoi and Yuri, or whatever we end up actually calling it. The history part is supposed to imply this is educational or informational content, and the word brief is supposed to juxtapose with the probably over an hour long length this video will end up being. But the worst part of this all is, we are still being so brief. There is so much more to this, but you have to stop at some point. And so brief here also means that you, the viewer, should take what we have taught you into your own life and do your own research to supplement it. Maybe just keep it in the back of your mind, until someday, a year or so down the line, when you tell a friend you really liked the summer Hikaru died, but didn't expect that gay shit. Then, this video will come to mind, and you'll think about how it's still a good story, and you want to see where it goes. Part of learning the history of these terms is understanding how they change over time and can become different than their origins. If someone calls someone a slut, they're unlikely using the archaic meaning of an untidy woman, but if they're a 15th century snob in a book, maybe they are. And if someone says they love BL, maybe they mean two twinks with a height difference fucking a hole unknown to modern science, or maybe they just mean Barra. Learning the terms and their history can help you enjoy the media you already love in a respectful way. Demeaning media that is made for sexual gratification and ignoring the stories with such themes just cuts you off from a lot of what you could be experiencing. To conclude, consider this interesting and long-lived history of Japanese gay media, and consider that there may be a whole world of stories you've skipped. And then maybe you'll think it's worth being just a little bit weird about fiction to experience them. As ever, thank you so much for sticking with us through such an especially long video. Next time we'll try to take less than 5 months to get something out. Motivate us by liking this video and telling us your thoughts in the comments. If you're feeling especially generous, you could toss a coin our way via Patreon, Ko-fi, or even YouTube members. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye-bye. The British Museum is often a hot topic when it comes to discussions of preservation and colonialism, and not to get into all of that quite yet, but one thing it does have going for it is its rotating assortment of exhibitions that help to bring certain time periods or artists to millions of people. One such exhibition was their 2019 manga exhibit in collaboration with Citibank and Sainsbury's Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, which was indeed set up by someone related to the supermarket guy and each other. But anyway, the manga exhibition took place over 3 months, and both of us went independently of each other, and took an annoying lack of photos to use in this video 6 years later. I went with my grandmother and got to function as a human version of one of those audio tour guides. The exhibit filled one large hallway and opened with a display of the tools a mangaka might use to traditionally make manga, before opening up into a series of blown up manga panels, original manuscripts, and a few older pieces of Japanese art. But more importantly, it had a gift shop, and since I was being such a lovely granddaughter, I was able to convince her to spend £15 on a manga, which was seemingly made in collaboration with the British Museum itself. I was fascinated, even more so when I read it and got to the part where terrorists dropped Stonehenge on the glass dome of the British Museum.
What?
Munakata Kyoju Ikaroku Daie Hakubutsukan no Bokan, or Professor Munakata's British Museum Adventure, is a 2011 manga by Hoshino Yukinobu. Assuming that most of you probably haven't or won't read the manga, we're going to spoil everything. But if you really don't want spoilers, then skip to this timecode.
Now, onto the plot. Professor Munakata is a specialist in fairy tales and mythology, who has been invited as a guest lecturer at the British Museum. He is enamored by the ethos of the museum and their ties to Japan, eager to use this as a way to broaden his understanding of both Britain and his homeland. Munakata has planned a 2-week stay to see the sights, but is sadly informed by his interpreter, Chris Caryatid, that their trip to Stonehenge has been delayed indefinitely because the whole area has been shut down for some strange reason. He gives his lecture on the power of dogu, which are clay statues from the late Jomon period, and is based on a real exhibition in collaboration with Hoshino Yukinobu, the mangaka of this manga. The professor ends his lecture by discussing how the museum has often been accused of taking artifacts without consent, but that their devotion to spreading human knowledge and wisdom in the modern day offsets a lot of their sordid history. There's an interesting implication here, where Chris, while translating the lecture, only seems to translate the positive aspects of his speech. It's an interesting decision, and I don't totally know if we read that right, but it potentially highlights the museum's one-sided perspective on their prior actions. Meanwhile, we shift 85 miles west, to a field. An empty field, or at least empty of what was once there. Deep gouges in the dirt and a small ring of 8 rocks are all the police find of Stonehenge. I adore the way Hoshino depicts the English countryside, the endless expanse of flat grasslands that almost feel like a storm cascading over England. The use of screen tones really helps accentuate this feeling. The next day, Chris and Munakata arrive to a police presence at the museum. Those small rocks are supposedly recreations of the pawns of the Lewis chess set. Chris cheerfully chimes in that in this specific set, the pawns are often referred to as hostages. Some classic foreshadowing there from Chris. In this mystery, Munakata is our lead detective. He dashes off deep into the museum to the Elan Marbles, a series of friezes from an Athenian Parthenon, and finds a bishop from the Lewis chess set. Oh god, what is that? Anyway, it's set down proudly and terrifyingly in the center of the room. A not so subtle request to return the sculptures to their rightful owners in exchange for their hostage, the stones of Stonehenge. An artifact for an artifact. The two proceed through the grand rooms of the museum and discover the night piece beside the Assyrian exhibit, which displays carved stones from an 800 BC palace. Further in, they find a warder beside the Benin bronzes in the African exhibit. All the pieces are so small in comparison, and it really shows the scale of these rooms and how many artifacts they contain. Each discovery is accompanied by Chris recounting the history of how each collection ended up in the museum, be that by consent of the ruling invaders or outright pillaging. Chris is very expositional here, but it works really well, as neither Munakata nor the audience will know the complex history of each artifact, even though some of them are highly popular. These artifacts are depicted in gorgeous detail. There's a clear respect for these artifacts from Hoshino to reproduce them and their intricacies. Each is immediately recognizable, adding to the informative nature of the manga. It was especially helped that several were in situ, drawn in the museum itself and then donated to it by Hoshino. Some of these panels are giving later Hunter x Hunter, but the slightly larger print actually makes this feel pretty reasonable. But anyway, a message from the terrorists is dropped off at Parliament in the form of a large stone slab engraved in Greek, Arabic, English, and Yoruba, a reference to the Rosetta Stone except using the languages of the stolen artifacts instead. And also English. The stone demands all the objects be returned to their respective countries in 2 weeks, or else the Stonehenge megaliths will be smashed. While the police investigate the scandal of the stolen stones, Munakata experiences the art of the British tea ceremony, as well as getting to explore the secret archives hidden in the museum, behind seemingly innocent bookshelves. I can't believe this manga is how I found out the British Museum has secret passageways, although secret is a bit of a stretch. It is then revealed that the Lewis Chessman pieces that the thieves left were in fact the real ones and not replicas. The ones on display were replaced at some point. But how did they get stolen and replaced without anybody noticing? How long has this heist been going on for? Chris and Munakata then visit the field formerly known as Stonehenge, and the professor attempts to determine how the stones could possibly have been moved without being detected. Chris then suggests they go to the neighbouring and far less impressive Woodhenge, since they're there anyway. This is the usual train of thought that leads people to going to Woodhenge. Although Woodhenge is the same age as Stonehenge and has a unique place in the rituals of the time, it is far less spiritually enlightening to look at, so people don't tend to go. The manga then discusses the history of these places and their importance to the people who made them. Munakata is able to take these concepts into his own research of Jomon-era stone and wood circles, with stone meaning death and wood meaning life in the histories of both our islands. Artifacts like Stonehenge are interesting because they're so familiar. As a child, my family would regularly drive past Stonehenge while going on camping holidays. It was never special, it was just something that existed. Sometimes you need an outside perspective to truly appreciate the things that you've always known.
Actually, to me, who was raised moderately pagan, I went to Stonehenge quite a few times for solstice festivals and even a special birthday treat. I got to go up and touch the stones during sunrise before it was open fully to the public for the day. This was a very atypical experience, as the other children made sure I knew. Caring about big rocks in general was a frowned on part of my childhood.
Anyway, back to the story. The simple construction equipment used to remove the stones are discovered abandoned nearby, and the people who were hired to operate them have long since fled the country. The 3 countries affected publicly declare that this is an action of an unrelated third party, and they have no intent to try and claim the artifacts, nor use the publicity to strong-arm the British Museum for their own benefit. This makes the return a little diplomatically difficult. It seems that either they'll have to piss off these 3 countries, or let the stones be destroyed. The story presents the artifacts as a political tool as well as a cultural one, a very apt use of their place in real-world history and politics. The story in general is fantastical, but is only 1 or 2 steps removed from reality. It's pretty believable considering the plot can be summed up as terrorists steal Stonehenge, especially with more recent real-world events, such as Just Stop Oil's attack on art pieces and, other art-related crimes. The pair return to the museum, which is in a frenzy, and the museum director, in the most English manner, is trying to keep calm and carry on. Munakata then meets Laura, the curator of the Japanese collection, who is alluded to be a massive weeb, and they explore the museum's Japanese section while a security guard ominously watches over them. The next morning, Munakata awakes to the police kicking in his door and a king chess piece resting on his windowsill. A normal morning for Munakata, going by his calm demeanour. I cannot get over how London is depicted here. The dark city streets are gorgeous, but look at this overcast sky. A storm is brewing. The architecture is replicated in incredible detail, and while almost definitely based on reference images or his own trips to London, they all seem meticulously hand-drawn. Cleared of suspicion because of, reasons, Munakata and Chris ponder the strange mystery of the stones over sake, her apartment filled with various Japanese items from her travels. I love that Hoshino knows exactly how weebs operate, but even surrounded by familiar items, Munakata can't relax. Something doesn't quite add up. Munakata then realizes the chess piece was a hint, and he says to himself he's been told to either figure it out quickly or go back to Japan. And so he does, but not before eating an entire apple in one bite. He surmises the king piece is supposed to represent the King of England, and the hotel floor told him which one, King George III, the only English king with a 3 in his name. And it just so happens the museum has an artifact inscribed with his name, the Rosetta Stone. The story spends a good amount of time discussing the morally grey histories of these artifacts, a lot of which I didn't know. King George III inscribing his name on the Rosetta Stone is by the way. Although, if you go and visit now, it's really hard to see. Later that day, Heathrow Airport announces that strange objects were seen over the Stonehenge site at the time of the theft, and the megaliths were most likely airlifted instead of moved over land after their extraction. An impressive feat considering each megalith weighs several tons. Munakata then goes to eat British food and likes it. Checkmate Americans. And also, Chris solves the mystery of how the pyramids were built. While heading home, Chris and Munakata happen across a security guard doing the opposite of security as he places a queen chess piece between 2 lion statues outside the building. I think it's these statues? I'm not super sure though. They chase him into the museum and discover a secret tunnel leading to an even more secret room. The original Lewis Chessman board and the plans for the whole plot quickly vanish before their eyes in the blazing inferno the security guard ignited to cover his tracks. They travel up through more secret passages in the round reading room, emerging out onto the roof of the museum. The security guard is seemingly concerned as police gather outside, and Munakata and the museum staff block the way back. The security guard reaches to the sky and is pulled away by a black stealth airship, Daughter of 20 Faces style. Then huge rocks are dropped onto the glass roof, smashing through and destroying parts of the museum. Luckily, our characters don't get reduced into a fine mist, and the damage is limited by the rocks being concrete and not the real Stonehenge stones, thus preventing the terrorists from being hypocrites. Whew! I was not expecting a chase scene in the history-filled detective manga, and it just gets more intense from here. Inside the damaged but not ruined museum, the other queen piece is found between another pair of lion statues. But what are the actual targets of these placements? Our dynamic duo investigate the secret room for any clues. In the remains, they find plans dating back to the 1800s, devising a method to steal the Stonehenge megaliths. Megaliths is a really hard word. As well as a drawing of a pair of twin lions. In plain view sits the chessman pieces that were stolen and had not left the museum at all, kept close and hidden to be recreated in this strange room deep underground. With the real target now revealed as being the Rosetta Stone, and most of the rest being red herrings, a few questions are left for Professor Munakata. Why did they want it specifically? Who was the security guard working for? And who built this secret room? With these questions and a suspect in mind, they leave to follow the lead. They search the house of the security guard, whose surname, Singh, means lion in Sanskrit, and discover aerial views of Windsor Castle, one of the many royal houses, especially as the queen chess piece between the lions looked up at the engraving on the round reading room, the Queen Elizabeth II Great Court. They also discover a large empty underground hangar built over many generations, just large enough to hide 1 or maybe 2 airships. Our suspicious security guard is discovered to be the adopted son of the Pullen family, a family who worked for the British Museum for generations, one member even being the construction supervisor for the round reading room. Their house seems mostly abandoned, with our suspect having moved on with his plans. The museum continues to operate despite the damage. Munakata, with his big ol' brain, realizes that the twin lions in the secret room were depicting the twin lions of France, Napoleon and Champollion. Napoleon had acquired the Rosetta Stone during his campaign in Egypt, and Champollion was a prolific Egyptologist attempting to translate the hieroglyphics. After Napoleon's defeat, not only was the Rosetta Stone stolen from him, his letters to his wife detailing her potential infidelity were also stolen and published in English newspapers. Nice to know we've kept up the tradition of tabloid celeb cheating scandals. Meanwhile, Champollion had to struggle with secondary sources for his research, while the British Egyptologists had direct access, and the British were not keen on sharing.
Money makes life happy.
Munakata theorizes that the humiliated Napoleon hired a spy and thief named Poulin to steal the Rosetta Stone back from the British, even if he did not get to see its recovery. Once the original two men died, Poulin's family continued their clandestine work, and 200 years later were finally about to succeed. The deadline draws near, and Sim calls them with a final taunt. If they give in and return the Rosetta Stone, it'll set a precedent for other countries to have their artifacts returned too. But if they don't, then the megaliths will be destroyed. A tricky choice. To signify the museum accepting this outcome, they must hoist the French flag above the main entrance, which is honestly worse than the terrorism. This exchange directly addressed the core issue the British Museum faces. If they return one artifact, they will have to return all the contested artifacts. While sightseeing on the London Eye, Chris explains how St Paul's Cathedral houses the tombs of the Duke of Wellington and Lord Nelson, who both defeated Napoleon, just in time for them to watch the stealth airship appear above the cathedral, megaliths loaded like bombs ready to devastate all that lies below. The ship anchors itself to the dome of St Paul's so it can't be removed, or if it is shot down, it'll plummet into the cathedral, destroying everything anyway. The situation seems dire. The final morning comes, and the museum raises a Union Jack in defiance of their demands. At the same time, the police deploy a small airship of their own, intending to sneak under and catch the wires to drag the airship over the Thames, where the destruction to human and architecture will be minimised. Luckily, nothing can survive in the Thames, and so there will be no environmental fallout from this. Not kidding. The Thames was declared ecologically dead in 1957, and only recently shook that label in 2021. 10 years after the manga was written. They successfully snagged the wires and released them with a series of small detonations, flying the airship up and around the bridges of London, before finally using the London Eye as a pulley and securing the megaliths over the river. This is supposedly a plan derived from a potential methodology of moving the stones used in the construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza, but in reverse. It's a tenuous link, but you know, inspiration isn't always so linear. Anticipating some sort of meddling, the airship self-destructs, plunging several hundred tons of rock into the Thames to be retrieved later. Somehow. The riverbed does not like to share its treasures. Trust me, I was raised by a mudlarker, and that bastard still has at least one of my shoes.
The colour pages for this section are gorgeous, the explosion bathing everything in hues of red and oranges, contrasting beautifully with the sea of a cityscape down below. The silhouette of the airship is a void cutting through the colour as if so hidden it can't be detected. The police turn to thank Munakata for his ingenious plan, but much with the airship, the professor is undetectable. In silence, we watch a second airship descend upon the neglected museum, ropes lower into the hole in the roof while a truck quietly moves through the museum to the Rosetta Stone, smashing through the glass and collecting the artifact like rubble and offering it up to the hanging wires like a sacrifice. The lights come on and Munakata stands there with police in tow. Taking a leaf from the thieves, the Rosetta Stone has been replaced with a fake and their plan was for nothing. Sing yells for Laura to escape without him. Laura, the director of the Japanese section of the museum, wasn't just a weeb, but was also a terrorist, acrobat, and aircraft pilot. Through an off-screen background check earlier, Munakata discovers that she is also a descendant of Poulin. She refuses to surrender, as she'll be dead for crossing the countries that bankrolled them, and proceeds to get shot through the head by a sniper. Having lost his colleague and second cousin or something, Singh decides to go all in and destroy everything in the museum. Chris throws herself in front of the bulldozer to protect the artifacts and is run over for this transgression. As she lays, dying, she requests the artifacts that she acquired on her travels be donated to the museum so she can be a part of it after her death. Her final sacrifice for the museum, and a representation of all the people who've died protecting it, truly embodying the caryatids of her namesake. caryatids. Munakata leaves England with an appreciation for all the people who had laid down their lives for the museum. The stones are dredged from the bottom of the Thames, and the sniper that killed Laura was never found. The true extent of this secret organisation is yet unknown, even though a few people were arrested. Jesus Christ, that got dark! And you said you bought this at the British Museum?
So that was the story of a book I got from a museum gift shop about destroying said same museum. But how did it come to be? What is the story of this story? This manga is neither Professor Munakata or Hoshino Yukinobu's first foray into the British Museum. Hoshino in fact had his own exhibit at the British Museum for 3 months at the end of 2009, to highlight his work as a mangaka. As part of this, he drew some pieces to be displayed directly in the exhibit while on site. Most of these included his character Professor Munakata exploring the British Museum, with great attention to detail of the artifacts depicted. Shortly after this, Hoshino was inspired to create a whole arc of his manga around Professor Munakata's adventures at the museum. Professor Munakata himself started his adventures in 1994 in Munakata Kyoju Denkiko, which ran for 42 chapters until 2008, moving on to a second series, Munakata Kyoju Ikko Roku, which had 49 chapters running from 2004 to 2010, with 10 chapters of this being the British Museum arc. From the start, the manga was intended to receive a standalone publication via the British Museum Press, which publishes research relating to the museum artifacts as well as books associated with collections or exhibits. Most of these are non-fiction, but there are some fiction books such as classical or translated novels. The British Museum Press handled the translation for Professor Munakata's British Museum adventure, as well as added a brief introductory history on manga. This means these chapters are the only official English translation of any of the 100 or so chapters in the series, and one of only a few of his works translated into English at all. As ever, France got many more, as well as some being translated into Italian. The foreword of the manga, by the then British Museum director Neil MacGregor, outright acknowledges the fact that publishing a book about your own workplace's destruction is a little strange. MacGregor is known for his attempts for the museum to reach outside of the usual Eurocentric exhibitions, which helped it recover from financial difficulties. Despite pushing for exhibits on Chinese, Muslim, and Persian history, he was staunchly opposed to the return of the Elgin marbles. The museum is very open about the history of where the artifacts it displays have come from, with a whole category of their website devoted to contested objects. And while they're often open about this, they do make it clear the museum believes in their right to keep the objects. Both the Benin bronzes and Parthenon sculptures of reality have the same history as discussed in the manga. In fact, in general, the manga is incredibly historically accurate. The close ties with the museum enabled this as much as it may have caused Hoshino to want to push or pull the story in certain ways. In an opening interview with the translator of the volume, Hoshino specifies that he did not let the collaboration adjust the story he wished to tell, or that it was meant as an advertisement of the museum. He also discusses how he hopes the manga can create conversation and spread knowledge, which I'd say it does quite well. There is a contemplative feeling to his work, and it feels a lot is left up to the reader to interpret. We're both English, and so this manga was incredibly interesting, as it presented a very external perspective of familiar concepts and places. One such being the British Museum and its place in colonial history. The manga presents a relatively neutral opinion on the debate, unabashedly recounting the museum's colonial history, but also appreciating its long-running devotion to preserving and continuing history. The story actually shifted my opinion on the British Museum slightly. I find my relationship to the museum is conflicted. On one hand, the global perception of the museum is as a symbol of colonization and theft. But on the other hand, most of the artifacts would have been lost to time, if not for rich academics with too much time on their hands. Most artifacts were deemed worthless during their time, and only in their preservation are we able to unlock their value. A bronze knife in the Bronze Age was a common sight, but now it's priceless. To add to this, a lot of artifacts and pieces of art go on tour around the world for everyone to see, and it's mostly for free. They do charge admin fees and require the objects be insured. It seems relatively minor, but could still be a hurdle for less well-off museums. And that unfortunately adds to the idea that only we, the sophisticated British folk, are smart enough to take care of these treasures, and that's, not great. The museum does attempt to spread knowledge to other museums, with yearly training programs for global museum workers. These are small scale, but very specific in their approach and target. Both Benin and Iraq, two of the targets in the manga, also have specific research and training projects associated with the museum. Both were started over 10 years after the manga, so it's doubtful it had much play in the decision. And Hoshino was pulling on pre-existing complaints going back to at least the 1960s. We're huge proponents of media preservation, but legally a lot of that work is theft, and companies can and will sue you for preserving media they own the copyright to, even if they have no intent to ever sell it again. The Internet Archive is even under threat because these companies care so little about preserving media. But in 40, 50, 60 years, when the only reason we can still play old games or watch old TV shows is because of theft, will the people be happy it happened? Truly, I don't know. And I don't think Hoshino knows either. I think it's funny that the antagonist of the story wants to give the Rosetta Stone back to the French, like it was theirs to begin with. Maybe these artifacts are just tools for the rich and powerful to extend their influence. Is that too out of the scope for this video? No, you're trapped here. And we're going to talk about nuanced socio-political stuff? The Rosetta Stone was created in 198 BC, under the instruction of King Ptolemy V Epiphanes, and features the three common languages of his kingdom: Egyptian, Greek, and Demotic, with the last being a formal form of Egyptian that utilised the different scripts the usual hieroglyphics. The stone itself is a fragment of a larger object, but the exact size is unknown. Because of this, all three sections have varying levels of damage, which affected translation efforts. However, most of the decree is now understood. Erected on the day of the king's coronation, declaring that the priests accept him as their divine ruler. It lists the great deeds the 13-year-old king had done, which includes investing in the temples, promising peace, and reducing taxes. To honour him, the temples would celebrate his coronation and birthday as festivals, and erect statues in his honour. The stone then decrees it should be written in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphics, and be reproduced to be placed in other temples. It probably remained in the temple it was placed in for some 600 years, before the Romans ordered all non-Christian places of worship to be closed. We do not know exactly which temple it was in, or when it was broken. A millennia after this, the stone, along with other ruins of the ancient Egyptians, were acquired by the Mameluke Sultan Kuwait Bey to be used in the foundations of a fortress. It was another 3 centuries before it was found by the invading French, by chance, after breaking a hole in the wall near the fort, and figured it could be of interest to their newly established Institut d'Egypte. And so it was shipped to Cairo for study. Reproductions were made and distributed across Europe in the hope of finally deciphering hieroglyphics, which was also lost to Egyptians of the time. Eventually, the British forces began to push into North Africa, and the hopeful French brought the artifacts with them to bring back to France after their victory. But there was no victory. The French tried to negotiate that the items belonged to the Institute, and the British refused to stop the attack unless they got everything. The exact details are unknown, but the outcome was that the Rosetta Stone came home with the British Army and was presented to King George III. It was then lent to the Society of Antiquities of London, who created casts of it for various British universities before handing it over to the British Museum, where it has remained since. Now we know what the Rosetta Stone is, and its entire history. Let's question each step. The initial temple that owned it was one of at least 4 that have now been found to have copies, so we know it was an item intended to be reproduced, and was functionally a declaration of the religious backing of the king. It is a mundane item, and was not entirely unique. Of course, such items are highly useful for social understanding, and scarcity is often inconsistent as a metric of value in archaeology. At some point, the temple and the stone within became under the ownership of the Roman Empire, who had the temple closed and seemingly did little with anything inside. Instead, more worried about social control than masonry. This is a relatively banal time for the stone, as it was just a change of the hands of the land it existed on that occurred. These hands then became the Ottoman Empire, who used it as rubble for a war effort. If you found a piece of broken and worn pottery in your garden, how much would you consider its history before using it in your fish pond? Even at this point, it was ancient history, but the desperations of war often caused social norms to be disregarded. This is not a good thing, of course, and the Ottomans did covet knowledge, but it was more in the pursuit of mathematics and physics, not history. The French were the ones to find it and first recognized the value it could have to understanding ancient Egyptian, which had been lost to time for the Egyptians of the 18th century, although attempts had been made previously. Having rescued it, they could have just taken casts and left the stone in the hands of Egypt itself. But the stone had value as a soft power play, especially as Cairo at that time was under Napoleon's rule. So who would they leave it with? The stone was just one part of a campaign to take over the whole country. The British saw it much the same, and also could use the acquisition to embarrass the French. They could have also left it in Egypt, but that was a contested war zone, and it would be far safer at home in the hands of scholars. And so, when looking back through all this, we have to think about how many people had taken this land as their own. Borders have moved, and empires have risen and fallen. Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman, French, British, they had all left their mark, and their people. The Copts are considered the ethnicity descendant from the Pharaonic era. They make up about 5% of the current population of Egypt, with some estimates saying anything up to 20. This is pretty good. There's still a lineage alive. Not all people were so lucky, such as the Picts of modern-day Scotland or the Gafat of ancient Ethiopia. However, of these descendants, how many would be in the position to receive the artifacts, and how integrated into wider Egyptian society are they? They are a big minority, and one that is represented in all institutional and political sects of Egypt. So it seems likely that both the people and place are able to accept the Rosetta Stone back. Not always the case for ancient artifacts, but this is just the blood relatives. The stone also had immense cultural value, with it being a prime piece of scientific history for, well, France mostly. They were the ones who deciphered it, but that was just one man, and he's also dead now. Any ownership from the French or British would be out of historical value, and there is a longer history than that at play. So then we have to ask, do they even want it back? Some countries are happy to have their artifacts on display in the British Museum, or are not around anymore to complain. Egypt is not one of them, however. Their first requests were in 2003. Their reasoning was that it had become iconic of the Egyptian identity and cultural heritage. However, it was also part of the British Museum's heritage, and arguably its history is what popularised it as a staple of Egyptian culture. They didn't want to hand it over to one specific country when they represented a far more international reach. But are they international? Many other museums also rejected repatriation requests from Egypt in this way, but is it an international museum when you're located in one country? As part of making this video, we went to the British Museum, mostly to get B-roll and photos, but also because we have that privilege. A train ride or so and we were there. And honestly, the manga had really inspired both of us to want to go. While we were there, we paid close attention to the relevant parts in Munakata's adventure, but also in general. And it was busy. Really busy. Even on a weekday, students and school kids and international students were all lined up to see and study these objects. And I couldn't help but think, how many would be there if they had to visit a dozen countries just to get the same experience? Does the variety bring value to the artifacts they wouldn't otherwise have? Would schools arrange big trips for a smaller experience? Would we have stumbled upon such interesting objects while getting lost if they were all 1,000 miles apart? This is why it's tricky to answer, and ultimately it's easier to do nothing, especially when nothing means you get to keep your prized possessions millions come to see each year.
Professor Munakata's British Museum Adventures is a seinen manga, and even by that standard it is very mature. Hoshino often self-identified as a Gekiga author, not a manga author, and equally understood his work as intellectual. It definitely raises the issues around the British Museum with enough information and a few answers to encourage personal opinion. The fact the terrorists are just as warped and hypocritical down the generations is an interesting characterization to give your antagonists. I think one of the few things I disliked about this manga is Professor Munakata himself. He's great, but he's also very flat, and almost a plot device to carry us through the story being told. It has at least intrigued me enough to read the rest of his work, just to see what he's like exploring his home country of Japan. I certainly learnt a lot while reading this manga, and it got us to visit the museum with a fresh perspective. So in that respect, not only is it a good story, but it's also a great advertisement. I felt forced to look genuinely critically at a monolithic institution. Our conclusion being slightly positive might annoy some people, so if you disagree with us or the manga, let us know down in the comments. I would love to hear your perspective. I've always felt that England and Japan share a lot of similarities in terms of culture and history, so I love seeing these collaborations. Now we just have to get around to making a video on the best TV show ever. Giri Haji. Thank you very much for watching, we hope you enjoyed it. If you did, feel free to hit like and subscribe and all the good stuff. Our thumbnail for this video was created by the very talented Brioche, so check out her socials on screen and in the description. That's all for this video, see you next time, bye! So the Switch 2 Direct finally released, and god damn was it such a change of pace. We love games and anime, but sometimes it's an incredibly stifling world to be in. The landscape moves so quickly, and if you try to keep up, you never truly get to enjoy anything. If you want to engage with the media on a deep level, you can't keep up with trends, so we, stopped. We haven't had the money or time to keep up with the last million best game, anime, movie, TV show ever. And as a result, video game showcases have started to feel a little monotonous. Game after clone after game of the same 3 genres of game. But to my surprise, the Switch 2 Direct and the Nintendo Direct before didn't feel like that. I felt myself getting excited. In fact, Nintendo as a whole feels like a breath of fresh air in the games industry. So let's go into it a little more than just a reaction stream. As a duo, we've both been more than a little disenfranchised with the gaming industry, watching our friends spend years getting into the games industry only to be laid off to a disappointing carousel of unoriginal streamer slop games. We have somewhat opted out of the general gaming zeitgeist. The fact we're impoverished YouTubers also means that we couldn't even if we wanted to.
We also like to try to spin things to be more positive. And while poverty doesn't actually build character, it can force you to play your backlog of games and not buy a dozen new games every Steam sale. Would someone employed play 1,000 hours of Slay the Spire? I think not. But hey, I was raised to be a Nintendo girly, so we watched the Direct. The variety of games on display and the endearing style of Nintendo just felt nice. We watched the State of Play whenever that was, and I can't recall a single game from it. It was just trailer after trailer of generic hyper-realistic shooters.
It feels like Nintendo's mission statement is always to let the players have fun. And obviously it's a company that wants to make money, but it wants to do that and provide a service that players want to use, not one they feel forced to use. Nothing exemplifies this more than the Switch adding a feature that allows you to trade digital games with your family. So now, if we both want to play a game that we've bought digitally, we don't have to get 2 copies. Much like the It Takes Two developer Hazelight Studios that allows you to play co-op with only 1 copy of the game. Maximizing profits isn't the aim. Having a good game is. There are downsides to the system, and it has its limitations. For instance, it's solely within the Nintendo Online families and has a 2-week upper limit. But as our friends have already worked out, you can just make a family group to make having Nintendo Online cheaper. Overall, it seems like an interesting way to encourage lending while also still allowing a digital marketplace. There was a similar system on the DS, but it wasn't for all games and only worked over a local connection. Overall, this system feels like something rooted in Nintendo's family console philosophy. There is very much an undercurrent of responding to general consumer complaints though, with a more robust kickstand, charging port you can access in tabletop mode, and way more internal storage, to name a few. The fact that on launch, the Switch 2 is launching with a fully functional pseudo GameCube controller is a great example. I'm so excited to play GameCube games with a GameCube controller again. While it's paywalled by the Nintendo Online membership, having all these ports from previous games is actually insane. A lot of GameCube games are highly inaccessible if you want to do it legitimately, and this is at least bringing some of them to you. Not to suck Nintendo's dick too much, but it really is affordable comparatively. While Microsoft and Sony are focusing on game passes that incentivize you to play a game as quickly as you can in case it gets removed from their service, Nintendo is content to sell you its games and let you play them at your leisure. Not to say Nintendo is free from faults, they have many, but it feels like they want to foster an experience outside of the blazing inferno that is the rest of the industry. As we tend to do, we wanted to analyze the way this had us so much more hyped than other game showcases. Part of it was definitely personal taste. We both just tend to play more games on our Switch and prefer the sort of games Nintendo makes. But it was also the delivery of the information. Fun graphics, constant presence of the developers, and a barrage of interesting information made it a constantly intriguing showcase. On release day, there are only going to be a few titles available. 22 of them. But yes, most of them are re-releases. Taking out those, that leaves you with Mario Kart World, Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour, and Survival Kids. The original Switch had 11. Despite this, it felt like there would be a lot to play. Improvements on old games or graphical increases, as well as an assortment of games that would be coming in the following months. The emphasis on technical improvements also helped make it feel like a worthwhile upgrade. Not necessarily one we'll be buying immediately. I got my Switch 2 years after release. But hey, maybe when we get a YouTube payout, we'll be able to buy a 6th of a Switch 2. Speaking of price, that's one piece of information that was conveniently left out of the showcase. Personally, I was fine with that at the time. We guessed around £350 and found out later it'll be just shy of £400. That's about 55% of a launch day PS5 Pro. The Switch 2 could be a Gen 9 or a Gen 10, but arguably it's the first Gen 10 console, so we'll have to see how other companies price their new releases, but as the Switch errs more towards a true hybrid console and not just a handheld you can plug into a TV, this price seems acceptable enough. What is less acceptable is the increase in games price, but I can't help but feel like people have forgotten that this happens with every new console. When I was a kid, I was buying DS games for $19.99. As a teen, Wii and 3DS games were $39.99, and as an adult, Switch games are $49.99. Also, as an adult, Switch 2 prices will be around £75 on the upper end. While I would like them to not put the prices up constantly, this isn't abnormal despite how people online are reacting. What intrigues me more is that they are finally doing something people have complained about for ages, making digital games a cheaper price than physical. Which sucks for me, because I love buying physical games, but I get the appeal.
The difference is seemingly about £8, and I'm curious how this will be taken. I can see that it may be deemed as a soft play at pushing people to purely digital, but equally, I wonder how many will be okay with a little extra to physically own a game. The digital cartridge system seems an even better idea for families. The game is cheaper, and your children can take turns playing without accidentally eating the cartridges, or like, whatever children do. One thing I haven't seen people complain about is the new larger size, so I would like to complain about it. Sure, it's great for all you normal size freaks, but the Switch was one of the few consoles that fit in my tiny baby hands, and I think that Nintendo is just bowing down to big hand.
Ultimately, the reason it felt so different was that it just felt like a different approach to gaming, and had us thinking on how general gaming communities suck big balls at the moment. Sweeping generalization, obviously, but this hype and hate cycle is exhausting to keep up with. We opted out ages ago. I don't think I've bought a game day one for actual years, let alone just because everyone else was playing it. Both of us are hipsters in the pretentious dickhead way, but equally we just don't jump on trends that quick. It's kinda sad to see people treating games as so disposable, especially when your average gamer is emulating the streamer approach of what to play. Allow me a small tangent for a moment. I love indie games, partly because they tend to be the only type of games we afford ourselves, but also because I love supporting smaller developers. Devs work for years on their projects and bear the full weight of their creative expression, in the same way we do while making YouTube videos, but instead of a month or two, the project spans years. One of the best ways for indie games to advertise is through social media and other creators, and that all worked well until the introduction of the streamer game. You see, a lot of full-time streamers have contracts with the platform they stream on. Some of them require the streamer to be live upwards of 8 hours a day. This is a problem. What do you do for 8 hours every single day? You have to be entertaining, it's not so simple. Well, there's an ever-changing Twitch meta. For a period, these streamers watched TV shows, anime, even YouTube videos. What could they do that required minimal brain power with maximum viewer attention? Then came the streamer game. Now this is only my perspective, so take it with a grain of salt, but the first I can remember was Goat Simulator. It was popular for its silly, easy gameplay for a while, and a few clones were quickly pumped out. This is the cycle I have an issue with. An interesting indie game is released, and picked up by Twitch streamers and gaming YouTubers. Then the clones start being made. Low-effort attempts to cash in on a trend. Sometimes they're well made, but mostly they're not. I just wanted to interject here to say games are incredibly hard to make. We both studied video games at uni, and yeah, they are ridiculously hard, so any game that actually gets finished is a massive achievement. And also, yes, there's deconstructions and parodies, and you can use other people's ideas to create your own, but I don't think that's what this is. In 2021, Townscaper released, a really interesting game by Oscar Stalberg. I followed him on Twitter at the time and watched him test his systems to create a small but unique experience. It sold pretty well and started a trend. In the years since, so many games have released with the exact same premise. Summer House, Tiny Glade, Gordlets. The games are all pretty and clearly have passion and skill put into them, but they tend to arrive a little after the hype and can suffer from trying to stick to a trend that has already passed. Another, much worse example is Lethal Company, a fun horror game where you and your friends rush through scary locations to bring items back to your ship. And then you have Headliners, a horror game about taking a helicopter to a scary location to take photos and bring them back to your base. Then there's Nuclear Nightmare, a horror game where you and your friends collect something. Backrooms Escape Together, a horror game where you and your friends explore spooky environments. Escape the Backrooms, Murky Divers, Dark Hours, Content Warning, Repo. It's just exhausting. These games rarely innovate or change. They do what works and content creators eat it up. There's a focus on quick-to-learn systems with an implied depth, lore-baiting a narrative, and often some level of rage-baiting to create challenges that can only be overcome by someone who has 8 hours a day to master a very specific mechanic. The current trend seems to be multiplayer experiences to create emergent narratives over the course of a stream. Repo deviates the most from the format, so that's nice, but the point I'm trying to make is that there's so many amazing games by so many talented people, and the ones that rise to the surface are the same things that have always done so. And it works! The biggest streamers get easy games to play, and the developers get paid. Win-win, right? Well no, not for anyone trying something new or interesting. Obviously it's not the indie devs' fault for wanting to cash in on the hype and keep their head above water. I've also watched at least a dozen Repo and Cabin Inspector videos because they tickle my brain in a certain way, but it's very much the fast fashion of video games. Nor is it really the streamer's fault for being pulled into predatory contracts that have them working more than full-time performers who need to maintain engagement for a full shift. And it isn't the fault of the viewers who want something easy to put on in the background while they write YouTube scripts or do housework. But it would be nice if more people were willing to step out of the hype cycle and come vibe with what makes them happy instead.
Money makes life happy.
Oh yeah, we went to the Switch 2 experience in London and could actually check some of this out for ourselves. First up, the actual event was an experience. We turned up way too early and hung around the doors awkwardly, but this does mean we were in the first batch to enjoy all that it had to offer for the day. After some queuing, the doors opened to 50 plus staff members cheering as we walked in, and that was our first warning sign for what was to come. As expected, the first game we got sent to was Mario Kart World. Filming was super awkward, and we were informed all footage had to have a person in it, so we didn't pass it off as faulty because the games are still demos or something? Even though some of the games weren't demos, but I guess they were running on the Switch 2 for the first time, or at least the first time the public had seen it. This made filming a massive pain because we didn't want to be in the recordings, and each member of staff kind of had their own idea for what a person in shot counted as, but we did our best. Most of the games were limited in some way. For instance, Mario Kart didn't let you off the tracks for the open world parts, Donkey Kong Bonanza wouldn't let you access the sub-levels, and most other games had a time limit baked into the demo. It was also at least one staff member per console, which got a little intense, and added some fun RNG with the games. One person might be super nice and excited, and another might assume because you're a woman you want to play the cute minigames and not the RPG, to pick some totally vague, totally random examples. Actually touching the console added a lot to our opinions that I think either of us expected. It just feels like an upgrade of the Switch, which is all I wanted from a new console. The main new gimmick is the mouse control, and it's not a bad gimmick. It's super responsive and easy to use. Metroid Prime 4 was especially impressive. Swapping from normal aiming to mouse aiming was instant. It certainly opens up the Switch 2 to more genres of game. However, I did find my hand was getting a little sore pretty quickly. Maybe it gets easier as you adapt to it over time, but having a mouse definitely opens up new possibilities. Games like Civilization Revolution are fun and all, but it's a very different experience from playing Civ 6 on the PC. Just having more ways to play games is a benefit too, and the Joy-Con works on small surfaces like sofa arms and your own leg, which we did test and is how we use the actual mouse for our TV, so honestly it's not so hard to adapt to.
In general, it feels higher quality with more metal and matte plastic and less shiny plastic. The thumbsticks have a little more resistance, and the bigger size still feels comfortable even for my tiny baby hands. The screen is much clearer and sharper, not just because of the larger size. Games looked better and were very obviously running on more powerful hardware. The welcome tour was actually helpful here because I learnt that that strange U-shaped stand was to free up internal space compared to the OLED Switch 1. This was used to cram in more processing power and an aerial. It is a shame the colours are more subdued, with just a little splash on the dust covers for the thumbsticks and on top of each Joy-Con. But they're swappable, so hopefully they release some more fun ones. Or, you know, get some custom ones online a few months down the line.
Or you could order these sweet Merrikiwi branded stickers and put them on stuff, like this Game Boy, to remind your Switch One of its heritage. Or this lizard, to remind you of your heritage. But anyway, since most games were in docked mode, it was hard to tell how it feels long term, but we did get to experience Pro Controllers, Joy-Cons, and the GameCube controller. Was it everything you wished for?
Yes, yes it was. The nostalgia was immediate the second my fingers brushed over those asymmetric buttons and oddly rigged C-stick. The iconic purple colour seared into my happiest childhood memories. If you couldn't tell, I'm a big GameCube fan.
But to be honest, even after all of this, I just don't see myself buying one on the release day, or maybe even this year. Even if it were cheaper, it's just not the big purchase I want to prioritize at the moment. But the experience was effective at pushing me towards wanting one, really at all.
The time between watching the direct and writing the script did mellow the hype I felt.
But I still feel excited about this console more than any others in recent memory.
As someone who doesn't care much for super high quality graphics, Nintendo has always been my go-to alongside a PC or laptop. But getting to see Cyberpunk 2077 and Yakuza 0 running smoothly with no visual difference on a handheld console
is pretty cool and impressive as hell that it fits in a device a little smaller than a Steam Deck and massively smaller than a PS4. I don't need immense processing power and 120 frames per second.
To be honest, I just straight up can't tell frame rates apart, as playing the Welcome Tour frame rate quiz proved. Nor do I play games that require it, such as online shooters. So for me, frame rate was decent enough on the Switch One, but I am excited to see how game studios use this new computing power. Having now played the Nintendo Welcome Tour, I do want to pay money for it.
It's adorable and a little nerdy. There's a playfulness that permeates it.
It doesn't feel like it's trying to sell me on the console, just excitedly showing off what it can do and the effort put in. It's an additive experience a lot of people won't want to have.
And I don't think making it free to appeal to those people makes any sense.
The little mini-games are a fun way to interact with the features in a very direct way. Can you feel the rumble of the controller? See the difference in the frame rate? Do you remember the information you just read for this quiz? 775 aluminium used in aircrafts. Of course the price could influence my opinion, but just because I think a game should be free doesn't mean I should get it for free from the company. And maybe if the price is too high for you, just don't buy it and make a point to Nintendo.
It was very noticeable how a lot of the games at the experience weren't entirely new.
However, I don't know why people are acting like Nintendo is holding you at gunpoint to repurchase Tears of the Kingdom or any other game.
You still have whatever you were playing it on before, so just stick with that if none of this appeals to you.
To tie it back into streamer games and the culture that surrounds it, why are you approaching games like a professional YouTuber whose livelihood depends on keeping relevancy? You're just some guy. Who are you performing the excessive spending for? If you have an interest in tech and gaming, that's one thing, but the average person does not need to act like an obsessive if they aren't obsessed. And if they are, you do you. You don't have to buy into hype cycles and should try to develop a sense of personal taste. Not only will this help you make better financial decisions, but you'll also have a healthier attitude to things that are not made with you in mind. But onto the event itself. As we mentioned, the massive amount of staff made it a little bit hit and miss. While playing that initial Mario Kart, people started getting bored with the short demo or wanted to move on. However, we were not allowed to enter the next zone until exactly 20 past 10. Like fine, okay, it's to keep things fair and let the staff be prepared for the waves of people, but we had to watch this poor member of staff be berated in front of us, just because she didn't immediately turn people around and send them back the way they came. Pretty much no situation should have you loudly disciplining another member of staff, let alone in front of a bunch of strangers. It was a bad look, and this woman was trying so hard to be nice and helpful with taking photos of people and giving out information that it came across really poorly. Another issue was that you were not allowed to bring drinks inside. Apparently this was in the small print online, but it seems ridiculous to confiscate drinks. This event was 2 to 4 hours long, which is way too long to go without drinking anything. It wasn't until we went to leave the event that we saw one singular water cooler, and were immediately informed that we mustn't dare take the water anywhere near the technology or else. Like, I get it, you don't want the mess and potential spills, but you couldn't leave the event and come back in, so it came across very strange, overly cautious, and frustrating. We also had 2 monster cans confiscated. Like, geez, we wouldn't have drunk them near the staff if you'd asked. Do you know how expensive Monster is in this economy? Sure, it's a bit whiny, but in general the event felt too geared towards people unfamiliar with games. From overly explainy staff to constant condescension, it felt like they hadn't been briefed on how to interact with a variety of people. Having such a tightly controlled environment was somewhat a detriment to the fun, with multiple instances of us being redirected to do the proper thing instead of having fun with these games. Of course, some of the staff members were good at adapting and jumping in when needed, but a lot of them weren't, and I won't blame any one individual, because I only interacted with these people for a few minutes. Maybe they were tired, or had been told off the day before and didn't want to make the same mistake. But in general, there was an underlying current of rigidity. Play the games as we want so you have the most fun TM. Only film in a way that won't allow you to portray the games as faulty or bad. Obviously, this is no one's day job. I've worked similar events and you barely get any information or training, or expected to work long hours on your feet and get paid next to nothing, if anything at all. The fault lies with whatever company was put in charge of this and the decisions they made. Big events are hard to run and manage, but it definitely felt odd. A lot of other people online had super good experiences, which is great for them. Maybe we were just unlucky, maybe we're both super sensitive to backseat gaming. Also, it was free, so like, can't complain too much. And we did have fun experiencing the Switch too, but equally I don't want to lie and say it was super easy and perfect either. We left pretty exhausted with no cans of Monster to revive us. I just couldn't get a sense of who this event was made for. Excited children and their begrudging parents? It definitely wasn't a press event because cameras were banned, so presumably this was supposed to encourage word of mouth and create a positive association with the product.
And that worked. To a point. This was a pretty cool and exclusive thing to see. The lottery system also helped to build excitement and make it feel like a special occasion. Around 800 people had tickets to the Saturday, and while we had to wait now and then, we still had time to spare. You weren't expected to do everything, and most people wouldn't want that. There was a decent assortment of games, including the 18+ zone, which felt very illicit. And then I just spent 20 minutes skipping Yakuza 0 cutscenes, beat up like 2 guys, and tried to complete Bakamitai before the demo timed out. Also, my dear father, who very kindly took us to this event, demands I complain about the merch situation. Apparently, the New York experience got a cool looking backpack. We got a tote with a metal water bottle, pen, post-it notes, and the world's smallest poster. Basically the usual array of shit you can get your logo on for a UK event. Apparently these rucksacks are super common at events in New York. I appreciate the cultural difference of suitable bags to slap your branding on. But honestly, we both use totes fairly frequently for shopping, and this is a damn fine tote. Compared to some others we've gotten as freebies, it has good quality fabric and is a decent size, unlike this Hyper Japan one we got, which seems to be crumpling under atmospheric pressure. The poster is hilarious though. It looks like it was supposed to be on the walls advertising the event, not given to a human person.
I assume this event was run by an external company, because the Switch 2 event ran counter to a lot of the appeal of Nintendo. The Direct made us feel like Nintendo prioritizes playing games the way you like to play them. No need to chase trends, just have fun. But the experience felt like we were being told there was a correct way to play each game and to never deviate. Nintendo, TM, should be presented in only the best quality lighting and must never look bad. Maybe it's the difference between the developers and the legal team. Overall, we still think Nintendo is a breath of fresh air in the gaming industry. Could they improve in places? Yes, undoubtedly. But equally, at least they're trying to do something different. Also, I will absolutely be buying that GameCube controller for the Switch 2. I can't wait. Thank you very much for watching, we hope you enjoyed, and feel free to check out our Patreon. For just £1 you can get early access and work in progress videos. If you want to keep up with what we've been watching, we have a monthly blog post on our Patreon that you can read for free on our Patreon. Feel free to follow us on Tumblr for gay omniscient readers viewpoint posts, Blue Sky for random thoughts, TikTok for like videos sometimes, and our second channel for lower effort videos. We've got stuff going on everywhere. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. Bye! Anime is awesome. It's got a story for everyone. No matter what you're into, there will be something for you. What's not to love? But when it comes time to share your passions with your friends and families, something feels wrong. They seem dismissive or uninterested. Maybe they tried watching your favorite show but couldn't get into it. Sharing anime is hard, especially if that person is older. It's easy to forget, but outside of anime fans, most people in the UK consider anime and animation in general as something exclusively for children. From grandparents to parents to co-workers and even siblings. Most of the people in our lives don't see anime as anything worth their time. No matter how much we sell the shows, as soon as they hear that it's animated, they lose all interest. In fact, it's gotten to the point where people in my life assume anything I'm recommending is anime and then immediately start to tune me out. That's probably why our videos are always full of recommendations now I'm thinking about it. The issue is perspective. They truly don't know anything about anime as a medium, but it's not their fault they're so uncultured. Sometimes you just need that one show to change your perspective. But you can't just recommend anything. I've seen so many best starter anime lists, and they all fail in one key area. They recommend blindly. They fundamentally don't recommend from the perspective of a new fan. They forget that people have preferences. If your mum loves romance, showing her Death Note might not be a good idea, or if your brother loves sci-fi, then maybe don't start him with Delicious in Dungeon. However, there absolutely are elements that we can identify. Things that you might want or might not want to show your potential new anime fan. Or as we're going to refer to them, your target. Let's get into it.
Before we get to the recommendations, let's work out what we do and don't want to include. Let's start with what we don't want. For the sake of example, I'm assuming the prospective anime fan is from England, but you can extrapolate the ideas to the general sentiment from your own country. Your average English person doesn't know shit about Japan. Like, seriously, most people I know don't know anything about most other countries, so we should avoid any anime set in contemporary Japan. Contemporary Japan, with all its unwritten rules plus anime tropes, is a lot to take in if you're not used to it. Let's remove as much friction as possible. That also removes a lot of anime. Another aspect is that we should try to avoid anime with a teenage protagonist. This isn't completely necessary, but your average adult will be more likely to be interested if the characters are also adults. And since we're recommending anime for your parents, I hope they're over 18. It also can't be too old. It sucks as fans of older media, but most people don't want to watch something that looks too weird, so it's probably worth sticking with anime made after the introduction of digital animation, unless you think your target will appreciate it. Maybe even be wary of anything that uses a 4:3 ratio and can't be found in anything higher than 480p. Now for the things we do want. It should be somewhat realistic. The more realism in the character designs and behaviour, the easier it will be to forget the show is animated. Again, we want to limit friction in the experience and let them suspend their disbelief. We also want it to have a good dub. I find reading subtitles incredibly easy. I can read and watch the show with no difficulty. For most people, however, reading subtitles is a massive hurdle. Let's not put that hurdle in front of them too early, so a good dub is a must. The anime should probably be in the seinen or josei demographic. This isn't an absolute, but if your target is an adult, then show them media made for adults. Demographics are blurry and both irrelevant, highly important to behind the scenes development, and a great place to start your line of thinking. Platform is also important. It needs to be easily accessible. A new fan isn't going to jump on a pirate site. Stick with the classics. Netflix, Disney+, maybe even a DVD if you can find it. Luckily, anime is very much everywhere nowadays, and a familiar framework will make it more likely they'll actually watch your recommendation.
With all that, we have a very rough framework to recommend some anime. And yes, I do personally think about all of this before recommending something to someone. It's unlikely that we will be able to find shows that perfectly match with someone, and we'll probably end up breaking the guidelines, but that's part of the fun. Finding something that could change your target's mind on anime. Once that first step is overcome, the next recommendation should be easier, and the one after that, even easier. Now, onto the hard part. Let's start at the beginning of the alphabet and the top of the box office rankings. Action as a genre can cover anything from Inception to Edge of Tomorrow, or even Sharknado. For your average action fan, I'm imagining they enjoy the high-stakes gunfights of John Wick or the globe-spanning adventures of James Bond. That very standard spectacle, violence, and underdogs. So if your target is like this, then let me recommend Black Lagoon. A series written and illustrated by Rei Hiroe and adapted by Madhouse, so you know the animation is gonna be incredible. Black Lagoon stars Rock, a Japanese salaryman who gets kidnapped by pirates in the seas of Southeast Asia. He's desperate to get out of the situation before realizing these pirates treat him better than the company he works for. Indeed, Rock, very relatable. He then abandons his old life to join said pirates. It's got violence, guns, a multicultural cast of amazing characters, and a fantastic English dub.
Dutch, this is a pain in the ass. I say we kneecap this pussy.
It's awesome to see the straight-laced Rock crash up against gangsters, drug dealers, and mercenaries. Plus, girls with guns are always cool. It should be a tone that's familiar to your action fan. Our next recommendation is along a similar line. Jormungand, the anime, not the giant snake, is a manga written and illustrated by Takashi Keitaro. The anime adaptation was done by White Fox. The series follows an arms dealer named Coco and the crew of mercenaries paid to protect her. Most of the crew are former child soldiers, and one, Yona, is currently a child soldier. The action is fantastic. It has that globe-spanning military vibe that Japan does so well. I am personally wholly uninterested in English or American military stories, but if it's in the form of anime and manga, it's fantastic. The desire to emphasize any one country as the most moral is less prevalent, and they tend to focus more on East and Southeast Asia, which is refreshing to us as British people. Hopefully your target will feel the same.
Emphasize the aspects of action they seem most interested in. It could be morally grey characters, a focus on military tactics, or maybe the horrors of war. When recommending anything, it's important to remain centered on your target's wants and not your own. Use phrases like, "You'll love this," and "It's just like X thing you like." Maybe even, "I heard of this and I thought it would be right up your alley." Wanting to share an experience should be mutual, but as the person asking someone to do something, you're the one with lower emotional input. Bonus action option. We just started watching Lazarus, only one episode in, but the action is awesome, and the dub is great, so that's another option. It's also set in a vaguely Western setting. Could be America, could be Mars, not sure yet.
Romance is a heavily cultural genre. Aziz Ansari's book Modern Romance, An Investigation is a great read for this particular topic. The same behaviours can be massively contextual, and even amongst subcultures could still cause miscommunication. So for this genre, you need to be aware that it can carry a lot of nuance. But so can all of these anime. The best solution to this is to offer yourself as a guide, and watch it with them. Let them ask you questions and respond sincerely. This also means it should be an anime that you've seen before, or you're confident in your Japanese dating knowledge. To lighten your burden, we will, confusingly, be recommending anime where romance is a secondary theme. Firstly, we have Nodame Cantabile, a manga written and illustrated by Tomoko Ninomiya, and has received both anime and several live-action dramas, both as a series and film. While live-action may be an easier sell for your target, it could equally be a massive turnoff. You'll probably have to watch it subbed, and if a dub does exist, it's likely to be very off-putting. A lot of people just have a strange aversion to foreign media, so we will be focusing on JC Staff's anime adaptation. But you know your target better than us, so just be aware that you have options. The romance is definitely a slow burn with a lot of time devoted to the characters and their trauma. The protagonist, Megumi Noda, is not the brightest person on earth, but she more than makes up for it with her talent as a pianist. She contrasts amazingly with the other protagonist, Shinichi Chiaki, who comes from a distinguished family and has dreams of becoming a world-renowned conductor. You get to enjoy watching them grow closer and help each other overcome their personal challenges. It's been a very long time since I watched it, so it might be time for a rewatch. Maybe with a friend who wants to get into romance anime. Our next recommendation for a romance fan was created by Yuki Kodama and adapted by MAPPA with Shinichiro Watanabe as director. Kids on the Slope is also a romance focused around music, but this time it's about jazz. It also has a 2-hour-long live-action film adaptation if you can't get your target to commit to a... well, actually it's only 12 episodes, so a little less than 5 hours? Kids on the Slope does star teenagers, so maybe we need to start some kind of broken our own rules counter. We'll put it, like, here in the corner. But it is fantastic and mature in its execution. It's set in the 1960s, so it avoids a lot of the modern trappings of anime. If your target enjoys jazz and romance, it could be a fantastic entry point for them. Hopefully, your target is a fan of music, but if not, then you can absolutely do your own research. My anime list is a great place to start, as you can search by genre. There are also user-written recommendations, so you can find an anime they might have seen or that you want them to watch and see what else has a similar vibe.
Mystery is a pretty broad category, and diverges quite a lot depending on its target audience. So we have 3 vastly different mystery shows to recommend, and you can just pick whichever would suit your target the most. Naoki Urasawa is not only a behemoth of manga, but one whose art style is immediately recognizable. Regularly focusing on realism even while depicting surreal situations, Monster is very much the pinnacle of mystery manga and anime, with its focus on Germany and inspiration drawing from the 1960s American TV show The Fugitive. It's a very good entry point. The anime was created by Madhouse and is on the longer side at 74 episodes. This isn't a bad thing. Some people prefer a long, slow mystery, and on a personal level, you could easily watch an episode or so each week and have a whole year of bonding with your target. The art is grungy with a surreal realism, the characters are distinct and adult, you and your target will definitely get sucked into its world of mystery. Odd Taxi, written by Kazuya Konomoto and illustrated by Takeichi Abaraya, and then adapted by OLM team Yoshioka, is a 13-episode mystery anime about an anthropomorphic walrus being pulled into a conspiracy around a missing girl. Almost entirely inversely to Monster, it is very unrealistic in terms of design, and the animal characters may read heavily as cartoon for children to your target. However, it's so pretty to look at, and the animals all behave realistically, which is to say, like humans. It's giving Durara a little bit, with its interconnected cast of characters all living their lives in the city.
Now my caveat for this one is I've only seen the first and last episodes, because I accidentally watched the last episode first and was very confused, and then didn't continue watching. Despite this, I've heard very good things, and it's on our list to watch, and it's also on Netflix, so it should be really easy to access.
For something a little more gothic and mysterious, there's Shadow's House. Written by the duo Somato and adapted by Cloverworks. We break our own rules once again because the main characters are children. However, a large part of the mystery is in what happens to the adults in this strange mansion populated with soot-emitting shadow people. This has a more supernatural vibe to it, which could be exactly what your target likes. Its unease is very traditionally gothic, with its weird house, twisting gardens, and strange hierarchies between the shadows and their servants, the dolls. There are 2 13-episode seasons, and the manga is ongoing. I really enjoyed the first season, and even though Miliko is a ditzy girl, her curiosity and tenacity are endearing enough to want to see it through. Sci-fi is an easier category to recommend for because it's already whimsical in nature. Your target should already be primed to suspend their disbelief just a little bit. All you need to do is give them a little push. Our 2 recommendations for this category are on the more realistic side of sci-fi. Both are near future and very grounded. Space Brothers by Chuya Koyama and adapted by A1 Pictures follows the story of 2 brothers and their attempts to become astronauts. Set in the distant year of 2025, it has a glorious 99 episodes, which covers about the first 180 chapters of the manga. This will be a great one to also get your target into manga because it only got those 99 episodes and the manga is ongoing. However, sci-fi fans should be used to disappointment, so it's chill. Although Koyama has expressed wanting the anime to continue after the manga ends, that was over a year ago, and the manga is still ongoing. Maybe your target will catch up just in time for that new season. It's so worth a watch if your target is into modern-day space exploration efforts. Planetas is a hard sci-fi anime dealing with the repercussions of space debris. Set in 2075, Yippee!
Written by Makoto Yukimura and animated by Sunrise.
And focusing on the practical day-to-day life of these space rubbish collectors. Its anime actually elaborates on the manga to fill its 26-episode run. JAXA were consulted during the production of the anime, and NASA were interviewed for the US DVD release, so there's a lot of authenticity here to entice your target. Both of these anime are character-focused with a hard sci-fi setting, so they should be easy to recommend if your target enjoyed movies like Gravity or Interstellar. And then, if they do start to be more open to anime as a whole, if they like action, you could introduce them to Cyberpunk Edgerunners or Akudama Drive. Or if it's the machines and the iron that interest them, you could recommend Bullbuster, or maybe even Gundam if you think it would work.
Even within genres, there's different elements people might enjoy. You might enjoy Star Wars for its fighters and lightsabers, whereas I enjoy it for the alien planets that might as well be fantasy. Strange, interesting cultures that aren't shackled down by your classic elves and dwarves. Speaking of different cultures. Historical settings are always a fun time, even if they absolutely weren't a fun place to live in. Much like the world of Orb, the Movements of Earth. Created by Yuto, who was born in, 1997? He's only 1 year older than me. Animated by Madhouse. Of the 3 anime I'm about to recommend, Orb is the most grounded in reality. Set in 1400s Poland, it stars scientists, priests, and people who just look up into the stars and wonder as they try to prove heliocentric theory. The catch? It could get them burned at the stake as heretics. It's so tense, and at times a little hard to watch, but it's so worth your time and it has almost no traditional anime tropes. It should be right up the alley of a target who has a fondness for scientific history. The main downside is that it doesn't have a dub, so it's a much harder sell. If they like astronomy but not so much linguistics, you could try to convince them it's Polish and that's why it's subbed. Next up we have Vinland Saga. If your target is one of the many men like me who watched The Last Kingdom and needs more Vikings in his life, then he will Defto Yukimura and animated by Wit Studio and then Mappa. The story spans countries and kingdoms. It's gritty and violent on its exterior, but don't let that fool you. There's a heart in there and it's trying to say something. Season 1 is very much a prologue to get you in the right frame of mind for it to ponder its own perspective. Because of this, I saw a lot of teenagers drop the show in its second season. It's definitely an anime for adults. Lastly, for my history recommendations, we have Kingdom by Yasuhisa Hara, with a massive caveat. I love the Kingdom manga. It's one of the few manga where when I decide to catch up, I just start again from the beginning. It's that good. Considering it's up to 835 chapters, it's a pretty daunting mission, but the story is absolutely worth it. It's a very masculine experience, the polar opposite of the Apothecary Diaries. I know they're set hundreds of years apart, but I'm talking about execution here. They both have similar court politics in historical Chinese empires, but the end result is vastly different. That's a whole other video though. Also, the first 2 seasons of the anime are kind of awful, apparently. I've never watched the anime. Maybe I just wanted to write a paragraph about Kingdom. Anyway, I could keep going with different examples, but we have a couple of real-life case studies courtesy of our lovely supporters on Patreon and a friend of mine. So if you wanted some recommendations when we do a follow-up video, follow us over on Patreon for free to get notified when we're asking. Speaking of Patreon...
Money makes life happy.
This next recommendation is specifically for a friend of mine who recently told me that he used to watch anime as a teenager, with shows like Death Note and Code Geass, but can't get into anything new because of anime's tendency to have cringy dialogue.
Hey, what the fuck? You got a fucking problem?
This is an amazing case study because he's very casual with anime. Of course he doesn't know the difference between shonen and seinen. He's an adult now and has adult tastes, but if all he's being recommended are shonen anime aimed at teenagers, then of course he's not gonna like them. I know he likes action and fantasy. From the anime he used to watch, a bit of mystery wouldn't be a bad idea. So my recommendation is Dungeon Meshi, or Delicious in Dungeon. Written by Ryoko Kui and adapted into animation by Studio Trigger. Set in a pure fantasy world with dungeons and dragons and all. It follows a group of adventurers who are somewhat on a journey to save a member of their group. Forced into the dungeon with urgency, they are unable to acquire enough supplies for the trip and have to do something radical. Eat the monsters.
That's gross!
The world building in this anime is as deep as the dungeon in it, with a lot of speculative gastronomy. While a lot of the meals are based on Japanese food, not all of them are, and they're very thoroughly explained, so the cultural context doesn't affect it too much. It's funny but not cringy, the action is fluid and entertaining, the world building leads you as the viewer to ask the same questions as the characters. You're left wanting to know more about the world and the people who live in it. The dub is also fantastic and easily accessible on Netflix. The first season is 24 episodes and the second season has been announced to happen at some point, so you have time to catch up, Alex.
The next recommendations are for Vera over on Patreon. They mention their dad mostly watches Family Guy and Archer, and their mum reads almost exclusively murder mysteries. So let's see if we can find something each of them will like. For their mum, we unsurprisingly recommend The Apothecary Diaries. If you've seen our video on it, you'll know we're big fans. Written by Natsu Hyuga and adapted into animation by Toho Animation Studio and OLM, it breaks a few of the guidelines by not being visually realistic, but makes up for it by having very realistic mysteries and a focus on topics that women, but especially mothers, will be intensely familiar with. Childbirth, motherhood, beauty, and the place of women in the world. Its setting in historical China also means it's a great starting point. Your target doesn't need to know anything about the setting. The protagonist Mao Mao is an outsider to the world of the inner palace and helps teach the audience any social context we might be missing. Historical settings to someone who knows nothing about the culture and country in question might as well be low fantasy. Emphasize that it's a medical murder mystery show with a historical setting. You can also pull on the feminine viewpoint and the vague romance. Pick the elements you think your mum will like. Honestly, I think it would be hilarious if you bought her the light novels to read. For their dad, we have two options. Because he likes American Dad and that style of American comedy, I reckon you could get away with Space Dandy by Studio Bones. It's got stupid humour and an especially fantastic dub, but that's only on the surface. If you get past the silly exterior, Space Dandy is genuinely one of the most amazing anthology series I've ever watched. The directorial and animation stuff is stacked with industry veterans, and that comes through in every aspect. Some episodes are stupid and silly, while some are high concept and contemplative. As it's an anthology, the show resets after most episodes, which allows for true creative freedom from its writers. A concept your dad should definitely be familiar with. On the other end of adult comedy, he enjoys Archer. Archer lines its overarching plots with humour. Because there's no reset button after each episode, there are limits to what can happen, but it also allows for more character development. A direct comparison doesn't work so well. Most spy anime are more serious in tone, and most linear comedy anime are for a teenage audience. So for this, I'll go with the shotgun approach, and hopefully something will stick. Great Teacher Onizuka is a manga series written and illustrated by Toru Fujisawa and adapted into animation by Studio Pierrot. It's a shonen and it's pretty old by today's standards, so the humour might not mesh as well as it could, but it's got a pretty strong dub for the time and meshes humour and action pretty well. It's also got a lot of heart. Hinamatsuri was written and illustrated by Masao Otake and adapted into animation by Studio Feel. Its absurd comedy is laugh-out-loud funny, starring a bumbling yakuza and a psychic. The shenanigans are off the charts. This one is seinen, but stars a younger character and is set in modern day. With Japanese school and yakuza social hierarchy systems, it's a hard sell to get someone into anime, but I'm grasping at straws here. Uramichi Onisan by Gakukuze and adapted into animation by Studio Blanc is another laugh-out-loud series, but instead of wacky humour, it is from its painfully realistic dialogue. This one is also set in modern day, but it's really good, so watch some clips and you'll know if your dad will like it.
So that was a lot of recommendations, but we're not done yet. We're better than a lot of other YouTube channels because we aren't just some guy, we're like two guys. But we still have a bias and can affirm each other. So why not ask some other people their opinions? We always talk big game about collaborating with other artists, so we actually did that. First up we have Dark Violet Cloud.
Oh hey Merrikiwi, you're asking me to recommend an anime? I wonder which anime I'd recommend. Made in Abyss is an incredibly hard watch, but I think I thrive off of pain. If you want an emotionally devastating show that's full of mystery, wonder, pain, and hope, buckle up, because you're gonna be in for a wild roller coaster. It reminded me a lot of Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach novels when I first watched it. Made in Abyss is a series where the longing for adventure truly never stops. It's a series that also doesn't pull any punches. The protagonists may be young, but they do not have any sort of plot armor. The series is full of juxtapositions, one of which being that these kids are forced into survival situations that even adults can barely stomach. There are themes of having to grow up early, bodily autonomy and what happens when autonomy is taken away, and how to deal with the loss of a loved one. I'd recommend it to anyone who likes things such as like Berserk, Fear and Hunger. If you like fantasy mysteries with a sense of cosmic horror and are okay with really dark subject material, I recommend at least checking out the first episode. But again, I must stress, make sure that you're okay with dark stuff because it gets really heavy. If you want something that's lighthearted and still hits you in the feels, I have been obsessed with the manga Shiba Inu Rooms. It's technically a shonen manga, but it's written in such a mature way. This series is about ghost dogs who are bound to an apartment that they live in, but can ascend to heaven under the right conditions. This one chapter tackles the idea of grieving over a lost loved one while still cherishing their memory, and I legitimately cry every time I read it. If I can describe the series in one word, it would be thoughtful. I find it particularly resonant because as I reach my mid-20s, I think about how my family is aging and someday they'll be gone. And as the landlady says, I need to turn the cotton candy strands of fleeting memories into hard candy before they blow away in the wind. I'd recommend this series to absolutely anyone, but especially adults. Thank you so much for reaching out to me to collab. This was a ton of fun and I would love to do it again someday.
Made in Abyss is maybe not the most ideal first anime, but maybe a few down the line, or if your target has that very particular taste, I can see his recommendation ticking someone's box. Relating it to a book series is also a great way to prime your target for something a little more abstract. I can see someone who liked Netflix prestige shows like Stranger Things or Sense8 vibing with Made in Abyss. Recommending manga is something we avoided for the most part, but if your target likes comics, it might just be you're in. Or even if they like Instagram comics, you could throw some 4-koma their way. This recommendation also worked on me because I decided to read the first chapter, which is free thanks to Viz Media, who haven't sponsored us, even though I asked really nicely. It reminds me a lot of the webcomic about death. The combination of humour and sincerity also seems like it'd be great for someone who liked the UK TV show Ghosts, but like if they were all dogs, not historical characters.
On to Kamen Rider Lambda and his take on anime for adults.
Anime for adults. To be honest, hearing this from Merrikiwi was really confusing because on one hand, while anime always gets the anime is for children stigma around it, nowadays it's completely differentiated itself from it. The best ones I can recommend are the ones that I've actually covered in my Horde Henry and Belfort and Lupin video respectively, Requiem of the Rose King and The Rose of Versailles. So I want to get this out of the way by immediately saying if you see a manga with the word rose in it, it's automatically peak. Requiem of the Rose King is pretty simple because it actually translates Richard III and Henry VI Shakespeare plays into anime adaptation, following the king of Richard III, who not only has to cope over the fact of his father's death from the rival army, but also for the fact that he is an intersex man who is shunned by his mother and is refused to be heir due to his body. I'd call Requiem of the Rose King an adult manga because it has more ties to that of dramatical series such as Peaky Blinders and Game of Thrones. And over in France, we have The Rose of Versailles, which, for people who don't know or are not too keen on manga, is one of the most legendary shoujo mangas of all time. And luckily, TMS Anime, the people who put Sonic X on YouTube, are now putting the series subtitled on YouTube in English and several other languages such as Spanish and French. Go check them out immediately. The anime captures the vibes of 80s anime with its slow animation, its beautiful art style, and the way it moves so 80s like, and the manga is amazing. It not only shows the beauty of Versailles in France and the romanticism of nobility, but also the glory of shoujo. I mean, Ryoko Ikeda literally was a part of the Year 24 group. She's a pioneer. I made a video on that too. So The Rose of Versailles can be considered an adult anime because, like Requiem of the Rose King, it focuses a lot on its drama, its real historical conflicts. I definitely recommend these series a lot. But also, Merrikiwi, thank you so much for having me. I've been eyeing to work with you guys since your Blue Flag video, and I'm finally happy I was able to work with you, and I want to see what you guys publish. Thank you so much for having me on.
This is a great recommendation because neither of us considered YouTube as a platform in the context of this video. However, YouTube as an accessible platform might require a little research on your end. While a lot of episodes may be uploaded by non-official sources, some official ones are out there too. Sometimes it's only one episode, but that gives you an easy way to introduce them to a particular show for free. These are also unlikely to be taken down, so you can have confidence they'll still be there in a month when you finally worn your target down. A lot are region locked though. While we specify Josei and Seinen as good places to start as they specifically target adults, there are anime that straddle the lines of these demographics or may have concepts that will resonate more with your target. Banana Fish is a shoujo, but if you knew someone who really liked Hannibal, I reckon you could have it in there. Every female Hannibal fan is a potential fujoshi, and we are easy to lure. I mean they.
Lastly, for our recommendations, we found a small penguin. So Pen, what recommendation do you have for us?
So I want to recommend the anime Uma Musume Pretty Derby to my old mate Martin. I'm going to run a half marathon dressed up as one of the characters from this anime. Growing up, we did some very crazy things inspired by Kuroko no Basketball and Free. We was able to go into the World Championship swimming, go and watch, and go and do some very silly things alongside of that. And I really do believe that Uma Musume Pretty Derby has that same sort of inspiring aspect. It has definitely inspired me to go do some running again. And I think that'd be so damn cool to be able to get excited with a mate like that, so that we relive those awesome moments again, you know?
It's so great to hear other people's opinions because this recommendation pretty much breaks every rule we set out. Uma Musume Pretty Derby is a franchise created by Cry Games, combining the addictive worlds of horse racing and Japanese idols. Pretty Derby depicts real-world racehorses reincarnated as high school anime girls. At least it's a relatively new anime. This is a great example of our guidelines not being flawless. You know your friends and family better than us, so feel free to ignore anything we say if you want. This video is more about vaguely working out what the people in your life enjoy and then finding them an anime that will suit them. If all you take from this video is a little more awareness of what you do and don't like, that's cool with us. Speaking of not knowing what you want, I think it's time for the weeb word of the day. Omakase is a phrase you may have encountered if you've ever been to a fancy sushi restaurant or a Wagamama's. It's often translated as chef's special, such as in the aforementioned Asian-style Japanese restaurant. It actually means I'll leave it to you, and is more for the intimate, high-class environment of a sushi restaurant, where the chef will prepare a series of dishes for patrons based on seasonal ingredients and tastes. So in a way, you could consider this video an omakase, but for anime. You don't have to though.
As we said earlier, part of our ethos behind this video, and honestly all videos we make, is that we want to improve people's understanding of personal taste, and recommendations are absolutely part of this. To quote Sun Tzu, prohibit the taking of omens, and do away with superstitious doubts. Then, until death itself comes, no calamity need be feared. Anyway, this is going to come across a little simplistic. And if you find yourself going, well, yeah, of course, send this video to a friend who sucks at recommending you things instead. While we mostly worked by genre, you can go far more niche and recommend by trope. This isn't really something we can do for you, but we can give you a framework to start with. Start within yourself. Pay attention to what you find yourself drawn to in a narrative, not just anime, but film, TV, books, and anything else you may interact with. Now you have an idea, look a little to the left. Is there something that often coincides with this trope or theme?
I think an example might help get the point across.
Okay, say you like media with a double life. Anything from Hannah Montana to Breaking Bad could be something you enjoy. But is it the teenage drama or the sincere implications of identity fraud that intrigues you? Did you really hate that one part in Dexter where he starts fucking his sister but loved fake science about blood? Either way, you will love Shangri-La Frontier, an anime about a humble birdman who leads a double life as a Japanese teenager. Practicing this skill will help you build up the ability to intuit if you will like something within a short frame of time, maybe just an episode or two for anime. Not only will it make you understand yourself, it'll also make you better at recommending things, partially because you can recognize elements your target might like, and partially because you can quickly churn through anime to double check if it'll vibe with them, or if the quantity of fan service might be a bit too advanced for them. But how will I know what tropes my target likes, I hear you ask? Well, you gotta ask them. Or
think about things they already like. Maybe stalk their letterboxd or mail. Break into their house at night and start alphabetizing their bookshelf by first name of author. Now you have a sense for taste, the next step is in finding other examples. For anime, Mal's recommendations are a great resource we already mentioned. I actually just assumed you all know what Mal is, but for the uninformed, Mal stands for My Anime List. It's an incredible resource for keeping track of your anime watching. We use it all the time. It has recommendations, reviews, forums, but also just has a massive database of anime and manga. Start by choosing a platform you know your target has access to, be that a streaming service or a DVD you own, and then pick a genre most likely to have the tropes you think they like. Unfortunately, from here on, you have to use your brain. Read synopsis, watch trailer, draw on your understanding of your target. You could even look up reviews and see how other people responded to a show. Of course, this is all assuming that you don't want to recommend an anime you've already seen, but you could still do these steps to double check. So often, I bring up something as a recommendation and then look over it again and somehow it had a 10 out of 10 on every point of the weeb-ass shit scale. For those unknowing, the weeb-ass shit scale is a framework for recommending anime. The weeb category is for things that would require advanced knowledge of Japan or anime to get. Ass is, well, ass, and tits. Shit is for general artistic merit. 10 on the scale is an excess of that element, and 0 is an absence. The actual numbers are irrelevant, but knowing your target's tolerance and where an anime lies in relation to that is kind of the whole point of everything we've been setting up. As advanced weebs, it's very easy to forget how much we actually know, and by extension ignore in anime. My main issue with this scale is that so often people using it vastly underestimate all of the categories. Actually, let's quickly analyze the examples used in the original Tumblr post. From November 2017, Tumblr user I am the Duke of URL sets out the rules of the scale. For weeb, they describe Cowboy Bebop as a 1, requiring no knowledge of Japan. This makes sense. Bebop is set in the future and takes place across planets and moons. Names are all English or would be familiar to English speakers, and the setting is a familiar mix of sci-fi and western. Japan is mostly irrelevant to the story, and while you could have some deeper insight by knowing the culture behind its creation, you won't be expected to know anything too specific. Next, they list Kill la Kill as a 6. This is arguably the biggest mistake of the post. Kill la Kill is easily a solid 8 or 9 on this scale. From the Japanese cultural context of modesty and acceptable nudity, to the constant pastiche of anime fan service and magical girls, to even the often missed feminist themes within the show, Kill la Kill is complex and fairly unintelligible without a lot of prior reading. Basic elements such as the specific school structure and uniforms or sense of conformity will make it hard to understand. Equally, this means the next example of anything gyno-anthropomorphic is also wrong. This is a niche subgenre of anime and has fallen mostly out of fashion in recent years, but it has fairly familiar concepts at play. The most recent anime I can think of in this genre is Cells at Work. The concept of your body being run by little animated guys is not only present in Western animation, it's been done several times over with Osmosis Jones and Inside Out. If your target was into biology, this would be a much easier sell than, say, Drugstore in Another World. On to examples of us. The Duke uses Studio Ghibli as an example of a 0, but clearly this user didn't sit down to watch Pompoko with their family. It doesn't matter how much it ties into mythology, you just can't explain giant raccoon testicles in a way that doesn't seem insane. In general, Ghibli isn't as fanservice-y as your typical anime, but there is a tendency to portray all of the works as mindless, cozy fantasies and ignore the themes at play. Arguably this falls under weeb more than ass, but I wanted to bring this up as an example of cultural variations and how acceptability isn't one size fits all, especially in the context of introducing family members. Because I also fucked up and showed my family Your Name, which has incredibly mild fan service I wouldn't even bat an eye at unless my dad was sitting 3 feet away from me. They don't give a specific example for shit, but they do list a rating in their final paragraph. Food Wars is a 4 on the weeb, 6 on the ass, and 3 on the shit. Very different to how I would rate this. I have a big soft spot for Food Wars, and I love all of its parts. It has made me cry numerous times. However, I am aware that is a personal issue. No way is it a 6 on the ass. This is a solid 8. The first episode has imaginary tentacles molesting a character. Weeb is probably fairly low. I can see it being a 4. A lot of the cuisine is Japanese, but a lot is not, and the overall plot will explain dishes to the audience.
The concept of a family-run food establishment is also common all over. Even the shonen-style food battles would be fairly recognizable to someone who's seen Bake Off or MasterChef. The free for shit is my main point of contention, because as much as I like it, the writing has its weaker points. It's absurd, and strange, and very unserious, which is why I like it. Most of the battles are very not based in reality, and the outcomes are not really logical. It's very much a battle shonen, but for someone who is unfamiliar with the concept of trashy funtime shows, this will be a hard sell. Even people who really like the series feel let down by its plot. I do, personally, love its dedication to rationalizing the Nakari family's ability to strip off nearby people's clothing, but it definitely pushes it to a 7 out of 10 for shit. All of this is to introduce you to a system, how to apply it, and give examples of said application. The same scale can be applied to other foreign media. If you're from America, an American high school movie might feel completely absent of any need for cultural understanding. But to us from England, concepts like homecoming, hall passes, and those red cups are things we need to learn before we fully understand the media. Cultural understanding, or the weeb part of the weeb-ass shit scale, is by far the most important factor. It could be the best thing ever, 10 out of 10 directing, acting, cinematography, but if it's too high on the weeb factor, most people won't bother watching it. And for some people, anything over a 1 is going to be too far. You can lead a horse to good anime, but you cannot make it watch Space Dandy Season 2.
I could endlessly complain about being unable to get my family to watch Giri Haji because the first episode is in Japanese. It's so good, go watch it. God, I really like recommending things. It's genuinely such a fun thought exercise, examining the media someone already enjoyed and then using that as a basis to find something you think they will enjoy. This video has 3 main goals. One is to help people with recommendations because, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, most people are shit at recommending media. I like it, therefore you should watch it is an awful metric unless that person's taste is exactly like yours. I watched it and I think you will like it is the best way to recommend. Hopefully we've done this by giving you a bunch of frameworks and examples to put in your tool belt. Second is, if this video does well then maybe we can do a little recommending series. You guys could ask us for recommendations for you or the people you know. On that note, if you do want to ask us for recommendations, the best way to do that is to follow us for free over on Patreon, so you know when we're working on another one. Lastly, it's to get better at recommending myself, because most of my recommendations get ignored, and while I understand why, it sucks. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you to Dark Violet Cloud, Kamen Rider Lambda, and Pen for their additions to this video. It's great to have more perspectives. Check out Dark Violet Cloud for the deepest of dives into Maiden Abyss. Leave your preconceptions at the door and let him guide you into the horrifying world of robots, curses, and humanity. Check out Kamen Rider Lambda if you're into tokusatsu, furries, and LGBT history. Lastly, check out Pen over on Twitch for penguin-based party game fun. All of their links are in the description. If you enjoyed this video or disagree with us, then let us know down in the comments. If you have any recommendations for someone or recommendations for us, then please comment as much as your heart desires, and also Patreon because, you know, we would like you on Patreon. We read all the comments, even the ones that irritate us. If you want to get a feel for the chaos going on behind the scenes, we streamed a bunch of the editing for this video over on the second channel, Merrikiwi, because I cannot sit still and that makes me sit still. Feel free to gently caress the like and subscribe buttons to push our videos on the algorithm, or share this video with your friends who need help recommending anime, and we will see you next time. Bye!
Bye! This video was initially supposed to be a different video.
Viewer discretion is advised for the following topics. All of them, and we mean that, especially if you're watching the uncensored version on Patreon.
Shintarou Kago's art made a deep impression on me as a youth, who should have absolutely not been reading it. It is the pinnacle of Eroguro Nansensu, and has always stuck at the back of my mind for its paneling and nothing else. Now I'm older and contractually obliged to make at least one YouTube video a year, it made me want to deep dive into his entire body of work and see how it evolved over time. So, I made a spreadsheet to track what of his manga I had read. I quickly ran into an issue, and not the normal one when I seek out obscure manga.
Well done, fathead.
You brought tears to the eyes of the lovely Lum, you bastard, you little shit!
Not only were most of these manga never officially translated, even the fan translations weren't on manga sites. but they were on hentai sites, and those are currently inaccessible to me, a person in the UK. So I had to add a column to my spreadsheet for if I could actually read them in some way. I always knew if I wanted to talk about this mangaka, I would be putting energy into a video that would look like a carousel of mosaics and unrelated landscape shots. Although, it would be a great excuse to send you to our Patreon, so pros and cons. However, if you are watching this video in a better future, when the internet is a free field of wonders, or you just haven't heard the awful news yet, the UK Online Safety Act was introduced in 2023 and required all applicable companies to comply by the 25th of July 2025 to enact changes to keep children safe. That deadline was last week as of writing this video. It was almost immediately used to censor information with personal identity held hostage. While large platforms are woefully inept at providing safety to anyone, let alone teens with their half-matured brains, a poorly implemented series of ID verifications that will arguably do more damage is not the solution. Trying to babygate the internet by asking for a passport and proof of address for entry ignores that the kids can just climb over the fence. And for anyone over 25, the idea of giving your face and phone number to every site you go on is dystopian and flies in the face of all internet safety as we were taught. A lot of the thinking behind this act boils down to the notion that there is bad media, which is an inherently corrupting force that will destroy your morality on contact. The second a 17-year-old, who in the UK can legally have sex, sees some BDSM porn, they are inherently changed forever. But what is this bad media? No one knows. Or more accurately, by design it's whatever those in charge deem it to be. The steps from seeing boobs makes you a rapist, to seeing protests will make you firebomb parliament, is actually just standing still. Kago's work contains not only perverted sex and ultra-violence, but politics. His work is often emphasized as horrific and overly sexual, or reduced to just being porn. It is pornographic. I mean, that's what the Ero in Ero Guru is. It's erotic, it's sexual, it's porn. But porn isn't an inherently bad type of media. Arguably nothing is. Porn is, however, a very unsubtle medium, but horror is too. There's a very straightforward goal in both of titillation, either sexual or fear, and most of the time good enough is good enough. So the combination of the two produces some interesting pieces of art. In Fetus Collection by Shintarou Kago, we open on a young woman, Miki, thinking of how her worth is defined by the desires of men. This panel of her head is immediately followed by one of semen dripping out of her vagina and onto the sheets. The panel is cropped to show almost no other part of her body. You could call this hypocrisy for demeaning her just as much as the men in the story, but when the rest of the narrative is structured around women competing to have the most abortions, with their bloodied corpses hanging off them like tinsel, you have to at least recognize there is something else going on here. The nonsensu part of eroguru nonsensu is often dropped, and when it isn't, it's just plain misunderstood. Nonsense isn't just about making no sense in your art. It's about making art in a world that has become unintelligible. The idea of women making elaborate bonsai out of their aborted children is exaggerated, but it very obviously pulls on ideas of reclaiming autonomy and maternal desire. So when the climax is the main character being blessed with a virginal pregnancy, and then hunted down by religious groups to stop her aborting their messiah, you're already in the mindset to accept this as a fine continuation of the story. The nonsense here allows a different exploration of this topic. It's entirely unfactual and purely emotional. There is impact in its strangeness, and in having to untangle the weird visual metaphors. You just have to think about what is and isn't relevant. Of course, Kago presumably had a perspective when creating the manga, but that doesn't mean you can't interpret it otherwise. Miki's messiah child refusing to be born is the singular final panel, and could mean anything. Is this divine punishment for her previous actions? Or is it giving her the purpose she wanted? Maybe it's just a joke based on her planning a fetal bonsai using an aborted adult. Even if it's just supposed to be a fucked up conclusion, there is some level of authorial intent. And that intent has an inherent political lean. When people say all art is political, it is often understood to mean that every piece of art can be placed as supporting the left or right wing. But that's not what it means. In this case, the term politics would be better replaced with social, political, environmental, and cultural influences on a person and/or people involved. But that's not so quippy, and probably won't catch on. Some of Kago's work is a tad more obviously and traditionally political, such as The Secret of World History, which opens with Adolf Hitler weaponizing 4chan to convince the Allies to commit suicide, only for it to be revealed he is experiencing a delusional vision during his own suicide attempt. Obviously political. However, in terms of the meaning of social and cultural influence, this absurdity was entirely sidelined to me in place of something far more fascinating. In this chapter, Hitler's method of suicide is carbon monoxide poisoning from charcoal briquettes. This is a method of suicide that is pretty much only seen in East Asia, where such briquettes are still used for heating homes. This is the exact sort of art that is targeted by the UK's Online Safety Act. It is gory, and sexual, and political, and even offers a way to kill yourself. The implication is that this sort of art has no inherent worth and is actively detrimental to children. I also had to wade through so many suicide helplines to double check that this was actually a more common method of suicide in East Asia, like I thought. While I agree it isn't great to give Kago's work to a suicidal 14-year-old, you also can't expect them never to encounter anything harmful. How often while walking around have you seen someone in a shirt with Junji Ito's artwork? Is this not also Guru? It lacks the sexual element of Kago's work, but why does that change that people are still wearing jumpers decorated with mutilation that they were able to buy in high street shops? The answer is that it is culturally accepted to be good art. Of course this is dependent on which culture, and it is somewhat limited to certain subgroups. People would absolutely take issue with this sort of art if they were aware of it, but the idea that there is and isn't acceptable art is the problem. There's an abundance of infighting over how a hey girl hoodies are bad, but wearing a shirt with a woman dripping in blood is fine. This mentality is an erosion of personal morality, mostly in niche online communities, but will absolutely bleed out into reality if it hasn't already. A child might see your anime jumper or your Pennywise t-shirt and it may make them uncomfortable, and that is bad art. All people must only wear the designated neutral coloured full body coverings just in case. In case of what? The Online Safety Act aims to reduce bullying, suicide, access to pornography, and harm. Vague. It also ignores children's wants and desires, and settles for a blanket ban on anything not kid-friendly, with no distinction between an 8-year-old and a 16-year-old, and even then the maturity within those ages varies. The ideal answer for keeping children safe online is for each child to have parents who care about their well-being enough to pay attention to their emotional state and adjust parental controls as needed across the 18 years of a child's life. But, well, that's just not going to happen, is it? And while abusive parents exist, to assume a government is only working with good intentions is naive. Much as a parent might refuse to let a child watch Matilda because it shows kids standing up to adults, the government might want to ban Kago's Dance Kremlin Palace for encouraging disapproval of the establishment. Said establishment is the now defunct USSR, yes, but look, I want to tie this back to Kago's art however I can. Satire is often specifically excluded in laws as it is a necessary part of a fair society. It is my human right to call the man in charge a dickhead and not end up in jail for it. And if someone calls me a dickhead, then they're allowed to, as much as I'm allowed to tell them to go fuck off and then block them. We live by the law of the honor of the jester. The first work of Kago's I read was Abstraction, a 16-page one-shot that quickly morphs from 2D paneling to a 3D interpretation of manga as a physical object. These little towers are inhabited by the grotesque implications of nothing existing outside the boundaries of any one panel, all sliced heads and limbs and genitals. The story is implied as the manga moves past the manga it depicts, skipping pages and showing them in mid-performance. The sex and violence was intriguing, but it was the structure that stuck with me. The idea of a story being its own little world wasn't a new concept, but the idea of that world being such a deliberate abstraction of the medium was fascinating. I also now feel it would be a worse piece of art were it not eroguru. The gore is inherent to the bifurcation of paneling, and if it was just blank inside, that would elicit an entirely different emotion. More hopeless nothing and hollowness to these depictions. This is inherently a story of art being alive, and living things tend to bleed and piss and cum. The sex too is an ideal subject for this kind of objectification. It feels grounded and messy and a little gross. It just feels thematic to the idea of this being a world that exists outside of the lines. A fucked up little show where each part of a panel claws its way into place and then leaves to do something else. A world that exists only in that moment of reading, ironically so static in attempting to depict the strangeness of motion. Rereading it as an adult, I was able to pick up on way more. I'm more than happy to declare this as the correct response, as Kago himself in an interview describes abstraction as his greatest satisfaction. It is arguably the distillation of all his ideas and concepts in a simple 16 pages. Dear God, I would kill for his brevity. My younger self definitely felt drawn to the taboo nature of it and the uncensored genitals. That doesn't mean she shouldn't have read it though. At around the same age, my mother passed on a family tradition to me, that being leaving your teenage child alone in the dark at 10 PM 20 minutes into David Cronenberg's Videodrome. Her father did it to her, she did it to me, and in the absence of a desire for children, I will do it to my cat when I get one.
Actually, you did that to me, and I really don't like gore.
I did do that. Both Abstraction and Videodrome deal with sex, violence, paranoia, and direct corruption on the human form as a representation of their effects. There was an inherent appeal in that exaggeration because it expressed how I felt as a teenager through visuals. Being a person is gross and weird and hard to understand. It isn't simple or easy or nice all the time. While my younger self didn't get everything going on, it was a comforting sort of horror. I was not doing great in my teenage years, and optimistic media felt more like a kick in the teeth. I liked things that were dark and edgy because they felt more real. Obviously, this was a pretty immature way of thinking, but of course it was. I was immature, I was 14. When I first read Junji Ito, at around that same age, on some dodgy app I downloaded to my tablet, I was so repulsed by the artwork I was scared to swipe on it, but I still read the entirety of Uzumaki in one night. I was obsessed. It fascinated me. It made me have a pathological fear of mushrooms. These were negative emotions, but they were in no way wrong for me to feel. I could stop at any time and look away or read something else, but on some level I enjoyed those negative feelings. I also learnt what I could and couldn't handle, and how to self-regulate. That was a learning process that led to me being scared and losing sleep, but in the same way tripping is a requirement to learn to walk, sometimes growing hurts. Which is also often a theme in Eroguro. Media, unlike social media, has a different effect on people, as it's one-sided. Media is static, and the only thing you can do is to it, and not with it. Social media is different in that it is a back and forth of interactions. This can be an algorithm or other people. But while it is different and has different requirements for safety, it isn't inherently bad. Social media gives us support groups and fandoms for that static media. It elongates their lifespan beyond the natural. For many, it is only online they can talk about the things they like, due to social stigma or just being unlucky enough to have different interests to their peers. It is also a place where you can not be yourself, or be someone entirely different, or no one at all. There is a safety in that, and a neutrality, because what harms someone may save someone else. Do I wish social media sites weren't so evil and manipulative? Yes. But I also always try to make this world a place where I can exist happily, be that online or in reality. And who has the right to decide how I do that? I can't really recommend Shintarou Kago's work in a casual environment, because it isn't for many, or even most people. But art is often not for the majority, and ideally never should be. In the gap between disgust and appreciation, we find ourselves bared to our own comfort and tastes. That gap should not be determined by the government, but ourselves. Or maybe a responsible parent where possible. All this rambling to say, I really like this mangaka's work, and I don't think the UK government should demand to see my legal name and address to read it, because I don't trust them not to go mad with power and also stop me ordering fried food on Deliveroo. I want to believe in humanity's ability to critically indulge in art and create weird fucked up shit that only appeals to 8 people. However, if more than 8 of you could like this video, that would be great.
Whoop boy, thanks for watching, we hope you enjoyed. This video was a very personal expression. It's a shame I had to censor so much though, so if you want to see Shintarou Kago's work in all its gory, then head on over to our Patreon, where hopefully they'll let me upload the whole thing uncensored. We post a bunch of fun stuff over there, from updates to early access videos to monthly blog posts about the media we've been enjoying. I really enjoy writing the blog posts, so they keep getting longer and longer. We also have a second channel with all kinds of lower effort videos, and of course if you liked this video then hit like and subscribe, or maybe share this video with a friend. A somewhat open-minded friend. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video. Bye!
Bye bye! Next time!
Anime has changed a lot over the years and will continue to change well into the future, for better or for worse. Media tends to reflect the times that it was created, but how much of that change is reflected in the protagonists of those times? In this video, we will be trying to create the most average anime protagonists of early anime. Anime has historically been stereotyped as a boys' club by Western fans, leading a lot of people who would love anime to just not bother. As is becoming our motto on this channel, there is anime for everyone, you just need to know where to look. Cough cough. But has this always been the case? Was early anime for kids or adults? If only there was some way to find out.
I've made a spreadsheet, categorizing every anime we could find from 1910 to 1959. The first known Japanese animation is said to be Katsudo Sashin, dating back over 100 years to somewhere between 1907 and 1912. But it's hard to find a definitive answer, and we may never truly know. The discovery of Katsudo Sashin happened in 2005, so what else could turn up in an attic or disused theatre? A lot of this earlier history is based on the information we do have, and that has shaped the data we collected. This early era of anime was experimental, and was often focused on actually working out how this technology could be used to do anything. Sometimes pulling on shadow puppetry and using a camera to record the play for an automatic replay. Other times, how to produce a series of images on film that seem to move. The novelty can often be missed and make these earlier anime seem strange and boring to modern viewers. But as we often discuss, it is important to look at the context around something to shape your enjoyment. And the invention of the moving image seems pretty cool. It's a wild west where the rules as we know it don't exist yet. Frame rate, keyframes, in-betweens aren't a thing yet. Honestly, the fact we can see these at all is insane. This is a century-old animation from another country, made by directly stenciling ink on film, and you can watch it on Wikipedia for free. Anime of this era utilized techniques their later iterations evolved beyond. Benshi were live narrators who would provide context of the setting and narrative, and even an explanation of the mechanism of the projectors themselves. They would voice characters, and often act as translators for showings of Western animations. There would also be live music to accompany the visuals, and so the Benshi had to be able to project their voice and time themselves to not be drowned out by the instrumentals. Even as sound was introduced in the 1920s, the Benshi remained popular for a decade more. With the backing of the Japanese government, the 1930s saw this medium become the ideal way to produce propaganda. So we broke down this data into 3 key periods based on this. Each is about the same number of years, which is convenient. 1917 to 1930 is the pre-war period. 1931 to 1944 is the warring period, and 1946 to 1959 is the post-war period. The warring period initially only contained World War II, but that didn't match up with the amount of propaganda seen in the early 1930s. It is likely that this increase was from Japan's invasion of China and the occupation of Manchuria, so we expanded that era to better reflect the presence of war in Japan at the time. Anime of this era is highly military focused, and sometimes educational, but there was still non-propaganda anime being produced, such as Ari-chan, which is about a female ant who discovers a violin. Post-war, we see a shift from military propaganda to advertisements and generally commercial works. A lot of these are adaptations of folklore or traditional tales, as well as more experimental works. There is a tendency to break down anime as pre- and post-Tezuka, and so, we wanted to devote a video to that less explored era, because while his impact is great, there was a whole world before that, and it tends to just be lumped together as early anime. The pre-war period saw the rise of the fathers of anime. Oten Shimakawa, who got his start as a political cartoonist in Tokyo Puck. Satoru Kitayama, who directed many of the early anime. And Junichi Kochi, the animator for many of those early anime. These progenitors could have had a far greater impact than we know. Most of Shimakawa's work was lost in an earthquake in 1923, which destroyed his warehouse. But that doesn't mean all hope is lost. Let's work with what remains and crunch those numbers.
Some quick housekeeping, since this is a data-focused video. We gathered a lot, but not all the data ourselves, and we want to be transparent with how we got all this information. But if you just want to get to the pretty pictures, then skip to the next chapter, which is at this timecode. It all started with a database found online of every anime listed on My Anime List up until early 2023. This was very useful. Thank you, Cooper Union. Links to this dataset are in our sources. This was then reformatted and divided up into date ranges. We also extracted demographic and genre information, which was harder than you'd think. Certain calls had to be made because the database listed all demographics, genres, and themes, and that was a little too much. So, 2 key genres were picked to sum up each anime. We then decided on the actual protagonist data we wanted. Age, gender, hair color, eye color, ethnicity, and sexuality were the 6 we picked. For this era of anime, a lot of that information wasn't super relevant or available at all, but we collected it just in case. While specific ages are the norm for modern anime, for these first decades we decided on child, young adult, and old. Gender was mostly obvious, except for animal characters, which were mostly listed as their species. However, some animals did have a specific gender, for instance being referred to as a father or son. Hair and eye color were pretty skewed towards black because a lot of early anime was in black and white. With animal characters, fur was occasionally classified as hair, and most of the animals had distinctly black or white eye colors, so that was included. Ethnicity was normally contextual, and we used names or design to decide. The majority of these were Japanese, but not all of them, which made the category feel actually useful. For animals, ethnicity was used to record species. Sexuality was pretty irrelevant to most of the anime, however, if a character was depicted with a spouse, this was decided as an indicator of sexuality. This accounted for about 8% of characters listed. Turns out early animation pioneers weren't that interested in depicting romance. Arguably because drawing kissing is hard, but that is unsubstantiated. We decided to exclude Chinese and Korean animation as although this is available data, this video is specifically about the conventions of anime from Japan. We also wanted to choose a singular protagonist, but a lot of these anime don't have protagonists per se. Ensemble casts are common, as are plots that follow a series of events instead of a singular character. When a decision couldn't be made, these were listed as various in the data.
Finally, we got the majority of information from primary sources, which is to say the anime themselves. We collectively watched or skimmed through all 134 entries where possible. It was a real pain in the ass, but we do it for the love of the game. Chances are we missed some anime or miscategorized some entries. We are fallible and had to make a call on pretty much every individual anime. Because of this, we noticed interesting biases towards specific kinds of protagonists and styles of presentation, which would have been less obvious than just the raw data. And you can make your own decisions, because we've made a read-only version of the file. Honestly, spending weeks on data collection is fun, but the idea of someone using that data for their own use really makes my dick hard. We hope to do follow-up videos for every decade after this, but unfortunately the data becomes exponential. The 1980s has over 500 entries, the 2000s over 2000, and so on. So this is a call to support this project. You can do that in 2 ways. First of all, any money we receive from Patreon, Ko-fi, etc. allows us to devote more time to these large projects instead of our boring day jobs. Secondly, if any people would like to help with data collection, please reach out. This is a very specific and time-consuming task, and crowdsourcing the data is pretty much the only viable way for us to do the later years. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's finally meet our protagonists.
Money makes life happy.
To bring our protagonist to life, we needed an artist, so we enlisted the help of art boy extraordinaire Dark Violet Cloud.
Hello.
I created 3 rough mood boards using the data we had collected for reference, as well as sharing the data and the script. We wanted him to have all the information we had while working on the art. This is the pre-war mood board that I sent over. I wanted to make sure I got some reasonably accurate clothing on there, as well as examples from anime of this period. It's supposed to quickly communicate what the data shows. According to the data, the average anime protagonist from 1917 to 1930 is a black-haired, black-eyed person of no specific age and sexuality, but they are Japanese. This era was often in black and white and uses a lot of fables and fairy tales as a narrative basis. This era is also primarily historical comedies, so hopefully that comes through. Viola also did his own research, which is great because we had some level of bias when creating the mood boards, and he would pick up on his own trends or be inspired by different elements. So while he's off doing that, let's explore the data and history a little bit more. This period had 30 anime give or take what we could find and spanned 13 years. It had the least women of the 3 eras. Samurai were a common theme, and although they were active only 50 years before these were made, they very much pull on folklore and the older, more mythological interpretation of what a samurai was. One of the earliest anime, Namakura Gatana, is a comedy about a samurai whose sword is too dull for him to kill passing civilians, based on the fun historical concept of Sujigiri. Instead, they knock him out and he complains about almost being killed. It is 4 minutes long and consists of a classic 4-act structure, often seen in 4-koma manga. A magazine of the time referred to one scene as being too drawn out, presumably a TikTok user who was isekai'd to 1917 Japan. It has a 5.49 on Mal, ranking it on the same level as Isekai Cheat Magician. At this time, Japan was characterized by a settling of democracy in the wake of the Meiji Restoration, as well as the new influence of Western culture and arts. There was also a post-World War I boom in the economy, but that had already collapsed midway through this period. Partially due to the change in power from Emperor Taisho to Emperor Showa, expansion into Korea, Mongolia, and China also occurred in this era and would lay the groundwork for the following era's nationalism. From this we can see a lot of interesting things. First of all, anime reviewers have always been like that. Secondly, we should be viewing these anime as what they are. First attempts at a very difficult and new art form. The animation is simple, and so are the stories, but that's no less impressive. Unfortunately, much like early animation in the West, preservation wasn't really at the top of anyone's agenda, and less so mid the war to end all wars. So most of the anime from the 1910s are just a sliver of what researchers could find. There could have been hundreds of anime, but in our dataset we just have 6. Most of which are short historical folklore-inspired works. For example, the 1917 anime Urashima Taro is a folklore originating in the 8th century about a man who goes fishing and then is swept away by the waves. He goes on adventures in Ryugyujo, the underwater dragon palace. When he returns, over 100 years has passed. My favourite bit of this adaptation is when he meets the turtle and just yoop. It's also bathed in this red hue. A common money-saving decision of the era was to use cheap-coloured cellophane instead of fancy clear cellulose. This anime was believed to be a work by Satoru Kitayama while working for Nippon Katsudo Sashin Corporation, but newly discovered magazines bring into question if it is that animation. No doubt it's an adaptation of Urashima Taro, but is it Satoru Kitayama's work? Who knows? Most of these debates aren't being translated into English, but what we do get to read is fascinating. There's an ironic element of shadow play where we just get the outline of information cast by external sources. Was Namakura Gatana boring because it actually had a runtime of 5 hours but only 3 minutes survived? Or was that reviewer just a dick? We don't know, and the language barrier magnifies it 100 times. Just keep that in mind with all of this. It's data and analysis, but at any moment we could find that everything we based it on was totally off. God, I hope it isn't though, this took months. The 1920s plus 1930 are a slightly more exciting decade with 24 anime in our data. The earliest anime is Norama na Jiji in 1924. We have no data between 1918 and early 1924, presumably because of the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake. As far as we know, the catastrophe destroyed a lot of the animation from this period. Speaking of missing data, if you notice any gaps in our data, then feel free to let us know down in the comments. I know for a fact that we're missing some anime, but back to Norama na Jiji, or An Old Fool. It's about an older man bumbling around a city and getting into trouble. It has a really nice papercraft feel with obvious layers of cards stacked on top of each other to create depth. The man himself is made of multiple layers so he can articulate. He's a puppet. Unlike Urashima Taro, this is seemingly a unique story, but with what we know about its production, that being nothing, we can only guess. With all the work put into inventing a medium, they probably didn't think to make a behind-the-scenes tour. Bastards. It's fascinating that during this period, the age of protagonists isn't very set. There are children and adults, and the ambiguity of it all makes the industry feel very young. They aren't targeting a specific demographic because the industry hasn't developed yet. It's just about showing these to anyone who wants to see the magic of the craft. Although almost all the protagonists are men and boys, maybe because most of the artists were men or maybe not. The one exception is 1925's Kanimanji Enji, about a young lady who saves a crab. This is the founding myth of a millennia-old Buddhist temple in Kyoto, but picking that myth was a deliberate choice, and they chose to make an animation telling a story of a kind woman. Towards the end of the decade, animators were already pushing the medium with more complex stories and visuals. 1929's Kobutori is a fantastic example. With detailed adult characters, it stands out amongst the Western animation that was being imported into Japan at the time. The last anime we have for this period is Muramatsuri. This one seems to be a music video or a sing-along for a jazz rendition of a children's song, or at least it's sung by a child. The song itself is called Village Festival, which is the same name as the animation. I think it's supposed to be sweet, but the version we get to watch just shy of 100 years later is a little creepy. You can at least find much better recordings of Swing Nippon jazzing up the melodies on YouTube. The rest of the album is much jazzier too. The audio in this anime really confused me while researching because sources point to the first anime to have sound being 1933's Chikara to Onna no Yoko no Naka, 3 years after Muramatsuri. Actually, on the spreadsheet we have anime with sound as far back as Usagi to Kame in 1924. What's going on here?
As I mentioned earlier, the anime of this period were accompanied by a live orchestra and a benchi to provide sounds and context. Muramatsuri was intended to be a sing-along for the audience, and the audio was recorded separately and added on at a later date. These were known as record talkies and would have the recorded sound played simultaneously to the video. Digital restorations often have the audio added by default, even if it was originally separate. Nowadays, we take for granted machines that can play audio and video in one neat package, but in the 1920s this was the best you could do. The song Muramatsuri itself originates from a 1912 book published by the Ministry of Education and was aimed at young children, while the bouncing ball was pioneered by Max Fleischer, a Polish-American animator who created the technique in 1924. While innovation is great, incorporating varied techniques is also the mark of a good creative. And there was a lot of creativity in this period, despite Japan still recovering from the First World War and that earthquake. But how does it all come together? Let's check back in with Violet and see what our protagonist looks like.
When going into this project, the Kiwis graciously provided me not only with a mood board of inspiration, but the list of anime themselves. I really love trying to draw in other art styles and figuring out how the shapes work, but I need a decent variety of examples. The problem is, when it comes to works that are around 100 years old, there aren't too many resources to look at. I'm not sure if I ended up compositing the average protagonist with my designs, or if I just tried making a protagonist resembling that of these time periods, but in the end, I did have fun with it. In regards to the pre-war protagonist, I mostly pulled from the protagonist of Namakura Gitana when designing this character. The actual animation is both charming and a little bit jarring, and the character design of this protagonist has this like chibi, kind of exaggerated art style that's still highly detailed. I had this set of notes where I wrote, chibi but not cutesy, kind of like the Diamond is Unbreakable cursed chibis. As the other examples on the mood board had softer features, I tried to sculpt this protagonist in a similar way. His face is rounder, and he doesn't have as many realistic features as that of the protagonist of Namakura Gitana. However, I think I ended up leaning into a sort of Osumatsu-san or John Arbuckle looking guy, but this was all like subconscious. I did not do that on purpose.
I can definitely see the Namakura Gitana influence, as well as Ubasutayama and Isenbushi no Shusei. Anime of this era often used cutout animation where body parts were separate and able to be moved like a puppet. This meant that you didn't have to redraw everything for every frame, allowing for more detail than other animation of the time. Our little protagonist is a samurai with his trusty katana in hand. This is the perfect way to express the era's use of folktales and history, as well as emphasize one of the few things we knew about him. He is Japanese and he is a him. While kimono and hariri were worn regardless of gender, the more simple designs were favored by men. Our protagonist is likely training for battle, and long sleeves and trousers would have just got in the way. His choice to wear geta instead of something more common like a jika tabi implies the rascal is a little unwilling to get dirty and prides himself on being well bred. Samurai were often landlords and had social and political power over the common man. Now we've seen him and know a little about him, what should we call him? Comment down below if you have any good ideas. We'll pick the names we like the most for all three characters. Well, the time of the samurai has settled low beyond the horizon, so let's see what awaits us with a new era and a new protagonist. Surely things will get better as technology advances and more money is invested into animation. The Warring Period is a fascinating time for anime. Animation techniques are improving, but the country is quickly militarizing. I'm excited to see how both of these elements are expressed. This era has quite a lot more anime, at 75 in a 15-ish year period, still a far cry from the 389 anime that came out in 2024. Side note, finding the total number of anime in 2024 was a pain. Seemingly nobody could agree, so I just looked at AniChart and added the 4 seasons together. Not sure if these numbers count leftovers between each season, but that's a problem for future us. But it works for illustrative purposes. Tangent over. Let's check out some 1930s anime, shall we? The first anime we have in this time period is 1931's Amiya Tanuki, or The Candyman's Raccoon Dog Dance. It's about a tanuki entertaining children by dancing and transforming. The animation is getting a lot more complex than a decade earlier. The frequency of motion is definitely increasing. I'm also like 80% sure he transforms into a minstrel show performer at one point with big round lips and white gloves he doesn't have in his Japanese form. If you want to learn more about minstrelsy, The Lost Crusader has a really interesting video on Japan and their relationship to the depiction of black people. 1931 also gave us Saru Masamune, the first anime to have the genre military. It's about a soldier who has to deliver a letter to his lord. On his journey, he saves a monkey and its child and is gifted a sword. He uses it to slay a boar, and then learns of a shortcut which lets him deliver the letter quickly, becoming a samurai for his deeds. All in all, it was pretty entertaining. Because of the military genre, I was actively looking for propaganda, so when the monkeys he saves start treating him with reverence, it read weird. They even go so far as to carry him around for part of his journey. Was this just for fun, or was the Japanese soldier saving natives only for them to swear loyalty to him, representing something? It pulls on a specific folklore archetype, where a person is rewarded for showing kindness to an animal. So maybe the military aspect is that he's just a soldier. However, this was made just before one of Japan's most intense periods of imperialism, so like, you know? It was directed by Murata Yasuji, who was quite prolific in the late 20s, directing Kobutori, Hanasaka Jisan, and Taku no Hone. By the 30s, the storytelling and animation of his projects had improved immensely. Murata Yasuji was a master of cutout animation. He continued directing for the next few years before leaving the door open for the next generation of Japanese animators. Kenzo Masaoka's 1931 nonsense monogatari Dai Ippen Sarugashima is surprisingly long, clocking in at just under 30 minutes. It tells the story of a boy who's raised on an island of monkeys. Kenzo Masaoka is maybe the most important person in the Warring Period. He's credited as the first to use cell animation and the first to create an anime with hard sound, an evolution of the record talkies. You might be more likely to know him as the co-founder of Nihon Doga Eiga, now known as Toei Animation. 1932's Rakoku Rikugun is fascinating. It might be the least impressive visually of all the anime we've looked at so far, but what it represents is most interesting. The English title is Armies of the World. It's about two Japanese men comparing the Japanese military to other global powers. The characters worry about potential war and Japan's military weakness. It paints a really grim picture of how the Japanese people felt at the time, reflecting the rising sentiment of nationalism in the shadow of anti-Japanese protests, such as the Shanghai incident in January of that year, after a mob attacked a group of Japanese monks in Shanghai in protest of the illegal occupation of Manchuria. Counter-riots escalated into full-scale urban warfare, where ships, planes, and thousands of men were brought into the city. Over the next month, nearly 20,000 people died, including civilians, as the battle spilled out into neighboring villages. A ceasefire was eventually agreed on by China, and 8 days later, after the League of Nations entered the negotiations, with a reluctant Japan, they also agreed. As a result, China was no longer able to have soldiers in the city, and Japan had to keep their military presence to a few units. The anime ends with the quote, "Japan is prepared to reduce its armed forces as long as the conditions remain reasonable and fair." I don't think they found the conditions reasonable and fair. I feel like Rekoku Rikugun is a turning point in anime, where the subtle themes of historical cultural power progress towards less subtle depictions of modern war and war paraphernalia. Arguably, you can still see this type of thinking in contemporary sports anime, where Japanese athletes are smaller and weaker underdogs compared to other countries. Which is why this history is important to look at if you're an anime fan. Without cultural context, you might not be able to recognize Japanese nationalism when it appears, and equally may mistake your own country's methods as being present when they're not. While you shouldn't be expected to be mentally on with all your entertainment, it's important to occasionally take some time to reflect and see if there are any concepts or themes that repeat in what you watch. A good example is 1932's Ume no Momotaro. It's about soldiers hunting a shark in their submarine. It doesn't feel like propaganda, but it does help get regular people and particularly children used to the concept of war. A notable part of the data for this era was that the average protagonist was an adult. Not only does this go against the expectation for an anime protagonist being a generic teenager, it was also priming the population to expect adults to become soldiers. Especially as from 1927 to 1945, Japan had a military draft. Those characters could be your brother or father or uncle. And don't worry, look how much fun they're having hunting marine animals on a cool boat. 1933's Nurakuro Shoei Nichiyobi no Kajiken feels like it's doing this too, with anti-aircraft guns and planes and parachutes. Actually, Nurakuro is definitely a product of propaganda. He's a soldier in an army heavily based on the Imperial Japanese Army. The mangaka, Sui Hotagawa, was a conscript in Korea and Manchuria before going to art school. As the manga progressed, it starts to tell the story of Nurako's military exploits against the Pigs Army on the continent. Like I said, the propaganda becomes less subtle the closer we get to Japan entering World War II in 1939. Nurakuro was put on hiatus in 1941 because the military needed that paper for ammo or something. However, this was several years after other manga, which speaks to its importance as a propaganda tool. Nurakuro started as more of a gag manga, and it's hard to tell if its shift to propaganda was a reflection of Tagawa's shifting beliefs or a man who wanted to keep his job. Tensions throughout Japan increased during the 1930s, coming to a head in 1937 with a full-scale Japanese invasion of China. This coincides with the data in a really interesting way. You can clearly see consistent anime releases up until 1936, and then in 1937 our data only shows one anime, Katsurahime. Katsurahime is really interesting in its own right, but we'll get to that. 1938 only has one anime, and then Japan joins World War II on the side of the Axis. 1938 through 1941 has very little anime, and none of it is military focused. And then from 1942, the propaganda and military anime ramp right up until the end of the war. The war impacted the production of anime, as more resources were dedicated to the war effort. So this increase in propaganda anime in 1942 is really interesting. My theory is that Japan was struggling from this period to the end of the war and wanted to project power to its people. The anime depict heroic Japanese soldiers or conniving Western forces, the one exception being Kyoroko Bokusen, that was intended to teach people how to extinguish different types of incendiary bombs. However, despite educating people on how to act during air raid sirens, there is still an emphasis on victory, with the army proceeding to shoot down all the planes and returning peace to the land. 4 months before Japan's surrender, Momotaro Ume no Shinpei, the first feature-length anime, was released. Momotaro is the most impressive anime so far, and especially at this length. Much like a lot of the anime of this period, it has quite a cute art style, implying the intended audience is children. To really hammer that home, the movie ends with children pretending to be paratroopers invading America. It feels like a message for the next generation. The depiction of English people is particularly funny to us for its unflatteringness. The juxtaposition between the cute Japanese characters and the tall, fat, ugly foreigners is a deliberate decision too. And another example of Japanese media depicting Japanese people as small and weak. This movie was directed by Mitsuyo Seo, who was ordered to make it by the Japanese Naval Ministry. It's a sequel to Momotaro's Sea Eagles, where the titular Momotaro attacks Pearl Harbor. Its impressive visuals are possibly because it was directly sponsored as propaganda. So they had the time and manpower to make it as good as they could. There's even a scene done in cutout animation by Kenzo Masaoka. Mitsuyo Seo is a very interesting figure too, but we've looked at a lot of history, so let's take a break, check back in with Dark Violet, and have a look at the character all of this inspired.
The key feature of the Warring Period protagonist is that he is a piece of war propaganda. With examples showing both samurai and soldiers, the art style leaned into a bit more of a realistically proportioned protagonist compared to the pre-war characters. I made my character with the mindset of him looking like an approachable yet formidable soldier. He is a very friendly face to a very unfriendly regime. I felt a little uncomfortable designing this character. I almost made him a sushi chef because of one of the example images, but pivoted to fit the wartime theme. And it feels weird trying to create a character that reflects literally World War II era Japan. I do not want to glorify or soften how horrible the war was, try to whitewash how gross the propaganda could be. This design is my least favorite out of the 3 that I made for this video, mostly because of this overthinking I had over the design. Also, I don't know, his hair, he's balding.
The Warring Period protagonist is impressively accurate to the way characters of the era were designed. He's an adult, but cute, so he appeals to all ages. He is overtly a military man, but the hairstyle appeals to a traditionalism, the same way using Momotaro did. It's sort of like if Beowulf went off to kill Grendel, but Grendel was a World War II panzer, and Beowulf had a machine gun. Our military man is proportioned, but simple and easy to animate for long propaganda pieces. His uniform is neat and orderly, because he is a good soldier who represents the goodness of the great nation of Japan. Violet's apprehension is understandable. This is a representation of a lot of atrocities, as well as a deliberate attempt from a government to manipulate its people into being okay with that. Arguably, Japan was very successful in this, with even contemporary Japanese people denying the country's war crimes. Incorporating symbols such as the rising sun flag or depicting real-life war criminals is a lot to ask of our artist. But equally, we can depict these things in a different context to condemn them or remove meaning if wanted. This can be positive and negative because nothing in life is simple, especially not war. The tight control of context by the Japanese government convinced several generations they were blameless weak people just defending themselves. That's a hard thing to embody in a single character design, and a hard thing to segue from.
The Warring Period has quite a lot more female protagonists compared to the pre-war period. The earliest is Cho no Sainan in 1931, and the last is Ari-chan in 1941 by Mitsuyo Seo. There are 6 in total, but that's more than the other 2 eras combined. Ari-chan was the first anime to use a multi-plane camera for the whole film. This allowed them to create a more realistic sense of depth and parallax by moving images longer than the aspect ratio in front of the camera. This helped to make effective animation for cheaper because you did one long drawing instead of a dozen smaller ones. Layers are another one of those digital art processes that were originally used in traditional art but then forgotten about. There is a tendency to deride digital art as cheap and easy, but artists spend a lot of time trying to make better art, and sometimes that means building a saw trap with a camera mounted on it and convincing 6 of your close friends to carefully orchestrate moving panes of glass to make it look like some trees move real good. Interestingly, Ari-chan was financed by the Ministry of Education. The powers that be in Japan clearly saw the potential of animation to influence children, for better or worse. It's interesting that Seo is best known for his propaganda because he was a leftist when he was younger. Before starting his own company, he helped Kenzo Masaoka create the first anime with hard sound, Chikara Onna no Yo no Naka. After the war, he returned to making leftist pro-democracy media even if the country wasn't ready for them. I find it's important to remember that most propaganda has to be made by some kind of artist. Sometimes artists work on projects they don't necessarily believe in. This is not to say these works are innocent, but that often the victims include those pressured to defy their own ethics under threat and coercion. After his final anime project, 1949's The King's Tale, failed to cover its costs, Seo retired from animation and started illustrating children's books. He died in 2010 at 99 years old. He outlived Osamu Tezuka by 21 years. Tezuka, who was inspired by Seo's work as a teenager. It's almost a little scary that some of the people who worked on these projects were alive at the same time as me. It makes World War II feel a lot more recent than I like to think it was. This period did have its fair share of non-propaganda works. For example, 1933's Kekaku Yobu, an anime about preventing tuberculosis, or 1930's 1935's Propagate, an abstract anime about growing plants, or 1937's Katsurahime, a story about bandits capturing a princess. This anime is particularly notable for us because of the behind-the-scenes documentary that was made. Not only is it amazing stock footage for this video, it also helps us get an actual look at the processes artists were using at the time. The director Nobuo Ofuji was determined to bring color to the moving picture. He tried multiple methods, such as using colored filters and traditional patterned Chiogami paper. The warring period brought so much progress to the medium of animation in Japan. From Murata Yasuji to Kenzo Masaoka to Nobuo Ofuji to Mitsuyo Seo and many more. The artists of this time innovated and pushed animation forward even if they had less resources in a land at war. There's so much more to touch on too, like Evil Mickey Mouse in Omachobako series Dai 3 wa Ehon 1936 nen, or how Felix the Cat's introduction in Japan helped inspire Norakuro. But if we want to get this video out before the end of the year, I think we should move on to the post-war period and our final protagonist. The war is over and peace has returned to the land, right? Rebuilding took its toll on Japan as a whole, but also the animation industry. Japan was under Allied military occupation from the end of the war in 1945 to 1952. During this period of occupation, our data shows 11 anime, the earliest being 1946's Mahou no Pen, directed by Masao Kumogawa. It's about a boy who finds a magic pen and uses said pen to help rebuild his war-torn home. The short film ends with him waking up from his dream and heading out into the ruined town with a sense of optimism. Despite the obvious propaganda at play, there is a sense that you cannot just magically fix everything, which is an appreciated level of realism. However, it is equally likely that it's trying to instill a sense of responsibility on those left behind to fix the damage done. So like, go get that job in construction, we have idealized American skyscrapers to build. This anime also depicts a woman driving and making her own decisions. In 1945, the American president pressured the Japanese government to give women the right to vote. However, the occupying soldiers had to be placated with prostitutes to stop them from raping local women. So instead of raping random women, they instead violated some thousands of women who were coerced into the work in exchange for food and clothes. They also removed old censorship laws and replaced them with new pro-American censorship that forbade criticizing America and also indicating that you were censoring information such as putting redacted or blocking out text. This would explain why Mahou no Pen is so American in its presentation. The future of Japan was America. And while the occupation ended after 7 years in 1952, the American military still has a heavy presence in Okinawa and a light presence throughout the country, down from 500,000 at its height during the occupation to a measly 50,000. Not to say it was just America, the British Commonwealth including Britain, India, Australia and New Zealand were also there. The occupation also sought to reform Japan on a fundamental societal level, encouraging unions, improving conditions and throwing 2 million tons of munitions into the sea. Despite this, many jobs were lost, especially animators, but others were able to persist despite this. In 1947, Kenzo Masaoka directed Suteneko Torachan, a very well animated anime about a lost kitten. Masaoka revisits Torachan 2 more times, in 1948 with Torachan no Hanayome, and in 1950 with Torachan no Kankan Mushi, the latter being his final directorial credit. During the occupation, anime was very cute, in tone and visually. The protagonists were mostly children and often animals. We also see a return to retellings and folklore with far less set in the modern era. When they are rarely human, which could speak to a sense of detachment from being human. This is just a trend, of course. After the occupation ended in 1952, the economy expanded rapidly, allowing for increased anime output. Animators like Tadahito Mochinaga, who had previously worked on anime like Ari-chan and Momotaro's Sea Eagles, had the freedom to experiment. During the war, he developed his own style of puppeteering, using whatever he could scavenge. He used those skills to make anime like Go Hiki no Kozaru Tachi and Oriko Hime to Amanojaku in 1956. He also worked on Beer Mukashi Mukashi, the first commercial to use stop motion in Japan. It incorporates live action and cell animation as well. Very mixed media, Very cool, Tadahito. 1954's Hanato Cho is very cute, but also has color for its entirety. And wouldn't you know it, it's Nobuo Ufuji again. That guy really wanted color anime to happen in his lifetime, and by Jove did he make that happen. I've been researching for so long at this point that when I check out the stuff on a project and spot a name I recognize, I get excited. He also directed 1956's Yuri-sen, a gorgeous anime about a flying ship. In the 50s, and with a free Japan, we see a massive increase in anime quality. Anime of this decade are finally good enough to simply be fun to watch beyond historical curiosity. A lot of very early anime is good for its time, but anime like Kaneko no Rakugaki in 1957 is just good. Directed by Yabushita Taiji at Toei Animation. It's about a young cat who loves making art. His pencil gets stolen by mice, and he has to enter the world of his drawings to get it back. I particularly enjoy the scene where they're just little dots chasing each other around. Its sequel 1959's Kaneko no Studio is also a really fun little watch. Instead of drawing, our little cat is a film director, and instead of Yabushita Taiji, the sequel was directed by Mori Yasuji, the storyboarder and key animator for Rakugaki. Speaking of cute cats, for no reason at all, I think now might be a good time to check back in with Dark Violet and our final protagonist.
Out of the three designs, I think the post-war protagonist is my favorite. Coming up with a kitty character based on old fairy tales was so much fun. I really love the trapezoidal and oval shapes of the cat characters in the examples, with these big foreheads and chunky cheeks. The cat with the teal scarf and the cat with the overalls are probably my favorite of these example designs. However, that one human kid with the snapback upsets me greatly, and I want to draw a tic-tac-toe board on his big-ass forehead. My take on the post-war protagonist is a sort of cat boy version of Pinocchio. I'm Italian, I gotta put in that spicy spaghetti, mamma mia. Mamma mia, mamma mia. I'm also not well versed in Japanese fables. The Kiwis informed me that these anime don't just touch on Japanese fables, but stories from all around the world, so my Pinocchio meow fits right in. The Scarf Cat and Snapback Kid both have these half-moon shaped eyes with a thick upper eyelid that I think is a rather cute design, and I knew from the start that I wanted to include that in my protagonist.
This protagonist is my favourite too. He perfectly encapsulates the trends of the era, and the cuteness that overflows from anime like Kaneko no Studio and Tora-chan. Looking at the data, he is, like the other two, also a him, with black hair and black eyes. I think our protagonist might be breaking the colour trend, but he's cute, so it's fine. Unlike the pre-war protagonist, who had no specific age, or the warring protagonist who was an adult, the post-war protagonist is a child. A fair chunk of anime in this period evoke early Disney works. That includes the animal protagonists. 6 out of the 26 protagonists are cats, and at least half are non-human. Towards the end of the decade, experimentation continued, and teams grew larger. Perhaps there was more investment into the animation industry, I don't know that for sure though. What I do know is that anime was getting global attention, and would soon be getting released in the West. 1958's Yumemi Doji is considered to be one of the first Toei Doga anime in color. The anime is a musical of sorts, and features a lot of traditionally dressed women, which is exactly what I would expect from the director, Fukiya Koji. Instead of anime, he was much more known for his illustrations of women in shoujo magazines. It was actually really difficult to find a credible source about his time working in animation. Even the British Museum was only interested in his work as an illustrator. Toei was in full swing in the late 50s, also producing Hakujaden in 1958, the first anime feature film in full color. The team working on this project was stacked. It was directed by Yabushita Taiji, the key animation was by Mori Yasuji and Utsuka Yasuo, and the in-betweens were done by Rintaro, also known as Hayashi Shigeyuki, and Okuyama Reiko, just to name a few. I had no idea how important these people were to anime before working on this video. Researching anime in general has given us a mild annoyance at Osamu Tezuka, mostly just because everything supposedly goes back to him as far as Western perception is concerned. And it just doesn't. There were so many animators that helped pave the way for what Tezuka did. He's just the most successful and well known. But when looking into things, you have to have a little doubt in your heart. Is that the truth? Did that really happen? Surely one man alone did not start everything in an industry that was up and running before he was even born. Mori Yasuji was key in developing the style of early Toei. Isawa Takahata has been quoted as saying, "Mori's influence on the world of Japanese animation was incalculable." Speaking of Studio Ghibli, Utsuka Yasuo mentored both Isao Takahata and Hayao Miyazaki. He also experimented with a lot of frame rate during his time at Toei. This experimentation directly led to the creation of the money shot, known by Western fans as Sakuga. Rintaro went on to be the co-founder of Madhouse, and lastly, Okutama Reiko was one of the first female Japanese animators that we know of. Any of these artists could have a whole video dedicated to them. But maybe that's not for us to do. Maybe you, dear viewer, could take a crack at this and spend 3 months going down a rabbit hole and try and make your own video on one of these amazing artists. The team that worked on Hakujaden then went on to create the final anime in our data, 1959's Shonen Sarutobi Sasuke, known in English as The Adventures of Little Samurai or Magic Boy. I guess the translators thought the concept of a ninja and yokai was too complex for Western audiences. Shonen Sarutobi Sasuke was the first anime to be released in theaters in the US, followed by Hakujaden a month later. The best part about experiencing media from another culture is that it's from another culture. I don't need yokai to become wizards or dokubi to become goblins. Please tell me about things I do not know and how they matter to you and the art that you make. Books can have footnotes and anime can have translators' notes on screen, but apparently that's too much effort. Check out this cool blog post explaining the evolution of anime subtitles and how much Crunchyroll sucks. Most of these decisions are made by higher-ups who rely on an audience that is uncurious and willing to accept whatever they're given. If you're watching anime in 2025, you can definitely stop for a moment and Google what a ninja is, or why it's probably not great that every anime adaptation of a Korean property is treated like shit. But that sounds like conclusion talk, so let's head into the conclusion. This video was so much fun to work on. Anime of this era are so fascinating to look at. Watching these anime and researching the time period that they were produced has given me a much greater appreciation for all the work these artists put into developing their craft. As we mentioned, so much of this time period is skipped when people in the West talk about early anime. It's 50-ish years. Skipping it is like if I wanted to write a video on Western animation, then skipped Mickey Mouse and started talking about the Flintstones. It gives an incomplete picture. Tezuka is a very easy starting point, but an inaccurate one. Perhaps the moral complexity of a Japan at war leads people to ignore the period. Not to say everyone ignores these anime, we found a fair few really interesting blog posts and articles written on the topic, but for a lot of this video we had to read up on the history, watch the anime, scour the internet, and construct the history like a puzzle with the data as our guide. It makes it all the more valuable to collate the information in an accessible format. Not only this video, but both the spreadsheet and the sources are freely available through our Google Drive. The more we research history, the more we want to create some sort of archive of everything and put it in a bunker deep underground where earthquakes and time won't touch it. But until we become popular enough to afford a remote land in Siberia, you can help by taking and sharing the information here, be that using our data or correcting us in the things we've got wrong, especially if you're Japanese. Even better, you should make a YouTube video and then tag us. We also have our own perspectives. The history we told and the characters we created were made by the three of us. We each have our own lens through which we view the world.
The biggest challenge of this art project really was trying to come up with design motifs from such a small pool of examples. Mimicking the art styles had to be the most enjoyable part of the process though. I really enjoyed it. I think for future installments of this project, these sentiments would probably be flipped. With more examples of anime, I'll be able to come up with average designs more effectively rather than creating my own version of like one specific guy that may fit in the era. However, I will need to figure out a new way of rendering the characters. My typical art style is rather painterly, and I heavily rely on the rendering process to make things look good.
The three characters Violet created for us represent three different periods in Japanese history. They represent many people's lives and a life's work. The first tells a tale of progress. Animation was new and they wanted to tell stories. The second tells a tale of a land at war, and the lengths artists will go to continue creating. And the last tells a tale of a tentative piece. Anime wasn't really an industry yet. I needed someone to come along and steal all the glory. But that someone is next video talk. What about this video? What did we actually learn and prove from the vague hypothesis that all anime protagonists are average-looking Japanese teenage boys? For gender, it was male by a mile for all 49 years. Even if we included every other gender and counted all the various ones individually, and then assumed the gender of animals, it would still be male. This definitely reflects the people making the anime. The focus on soldiers during the warring period also skews this to male. The Post-war did see 3 anime with both male and female protagonists, 2 were young, likely appealing to children of both genders, and the third is Adam and Eve. Women were, however, present even in the earliest anime, Kanimanji Enji in 1925 specifically. I think it's important to note that while it was a bit of a boys' club on and off the screen, that doesn't mean there were only men. We have 10 female protagonists, so 7.6% of our protag-kuns were actually protag-chans. Super excited to see how this number changes in the future. Surely it won't get lower, right? For a lot of the anime, we could only find some production information, and so only talked about the directors. They would have had teams, and their work goes entirely uncredited. As was often the case, these teams consisted of men and women, especially during the war. I have no doubt that women worked on these projects. We mention Okutama Reiko as one of the first female animators only because that's how she's referred to.
People sometimes bemoan how long credits on movies are these days, and why catering or accountants are there at all. But I think it does an audience good to understand how many people are needed in a project. Bit of a tangent, but I used to work in a warehouse, and one day I had to fill an order that was expected to take exactly 60 minutes. Because lifting boxes is boring as fuck, I spent most of that time thinking, in particular about how much my pay was in comparison to how much all those products would be sold for. But I also knew before they got to me, they had to be put in the warehouse, and before that, they were packaged. I thought back along all the steps of the logistics chain until I got to farmers and other primary industries. And then I thought forwards to where they would go after I placed the pallet. The person who would move them into the lorries, the drivers of said lorries, and the workers who would stack the shelves and sell the products. I was a very small cog in a very big machine, but that's just how logistics works. I probably missed a dozen steps in my thoughts, such as nutritionists or marketers and whatnot, but the point was that I came out of that hour with a more holistic understanding of how nothing is done by just one person. The 1999 children's book, Beans on Toast by Paul Dowling, is a great introduction to the economics of logistics that a lot of people would do good to read. But equally, I feel this video is a meditation on these same concepts. Anime isn't made by one director or one animator. A lot of people contributed techniques and technology, and all of that came together over the years. Learning the history and how many thousands of people are forever captured in every part of anime is a little comforting. Society as a whole is founded on everyone who came before us. This was supposed to be a video on century-old anime protagonists, but without all this interesting history, what would this data actually tell us?
There was so much more we could go into, but we really wanted to post this video by the end of the year. Maybe in upcoming videos, we can talk about the difference between cellulose and celluloid in cell animation, or how smear frames came to be. But even if we don't, hopefully your curiosity will take you there on your own. But please stay with us a little longer. Only 3 protagonists had hair that wasn't black. This is skewed by the black and white nature of these films, but as anyone who reads manga would know, there can be implications of other hair colors, like blonde and blue. The 2 blondes are actually Kaneko from Kaneko no Studio and Kaneko from Kaneko no Rakugaki, who is noticeably not a black cat, even in grayscale. The blue head character is green head, so apparently I'm colorblind. Either way, this marks our first character to have vibrant anime hair. In 1955's Onbu Obake. Eye color is pretty much the same except with a few blue eyes and a magical ninja samurai boy Sasuke who has explicitly brown eyes and black hair. But this is also a great reminder that averages are just average. Many anime were entirely different to the statistical calculations of a half-century of data. So while there were a lot of black-haired, black-eyed Japanese boys, sometimes there were also crabs and cats and whales and boats and women. Age was very hard to define in this era, so this is the data I have the least faith in. Most of it was contextual, or we went by descriptions. I was still surprised by how many were adults. Almost as many protagonists were adults as children. We even have some old guys and some young adults. But I can't wait for actual age numbers to get involved in future videos. Arguably this is because teenagers hadn't really been invented yet, but it's also obviously because these anime were made with other demographics in mind, namely children and a nation at war. 2 of our protagonists are adults with jobs and 1 is a kitten. Sexual orientation was fairly worthless at this point in time. We have 11 heterosexuals, and even then that's an assumption based on a character having a spouse of the opposite gender. More heterosexuals than women though. Not much to say here for this data, but the fact there is no data shows that romance as a genre wasn't something these early animators wanted to focus on. We have 1 romance anime, and even then it's a secondary genre. and the plot is about marriage and status rather than love. A lot of these labels are retroactive, and so there's a level of conformity that doesn't necessarily line up with the reality of these anime. But the same could be said of modern anime. That's why subgenres and themes exist. But mostly it's just a small piece of info for you to get a sort of understanding of what something's about. Only 35% of these anime have a second genre, which could be a sign of their small scale and simplicity, or that it was hard enough to pick one genre and no one cares to update 100-year-old Mel listings. They will, however, leave reviews telling you to not bother with all this fascinating history because it's boring and has no sound. If you are one of those people, and you have somehow found this video, go and change your review right now. Look at the weight of all of this history and tell me you wouldn't recommend the foundation of this medium we all love. A big thank you to Dark Violet Cloud for his art, perspective, and the ability to spell. Make sure you subscribe to his YouTube channel and check out his comic linked in the description. This video, as usual, took us longer to make than expected, but hopefully it was worth it.
I'd like to say one last thank you to the Kiwis for reaching out to me. I'm having a lot of fun with this and look forward to working with you two again in the future. Note, do not mention how you are locked in the basement with nothing but ramen noodles and you'll be rewarded with 1 hour of sunlight exposure.
We streamed a lot of the editing over on the second channel, and the Patreon got regular work-in-progress uploads. If you enjoyed and want to help push us to make more and more complex videos, then feel free to support us on Patreon. But most importantly, it would mean a lot to us if you liked and shared the video. These videos take ages, and any help pushing them to more people would be massively appreciated. Also, honestly, thank God for YouTube channels that bother to upload early anime, because modern streaming sites don't, and neither do the pirate ones. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next, hopefully shorter video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you're looking forward to the next Merrikiwi video, coming hopefully soon!